slaps true. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it. Nigga, stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Nigga, we ain't playing around. Karate chop, nigga, that's gon' lay him down. I got it from my sensei. A Ku Klux, so I bought me 10Ks. My shooter got me, I made sure his rent paid. A grimy nigga, but he don't wear 10K. He wears Givenchy, he don't even fit J's. A sharpshooter, you should see him switchblade. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it. Nigga, stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Add me on Twitter, that's gon' get you in the jam. Stop playing with that man. 223 shells and knock a nigga out his frame. Stop playing with that man. Ever been indicted, I ain't see you in that jam. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Niggas acting like fans. Some shit I never understand. Is you gangster or not? That's for Instagram, you don't hang on the block. This a hunt Diddy, I don't hang with no stops. You a brand lover, bitch, you bang with the ops. You like felons, cause I came with a lot. A tough cookie put his brains in a knot. How much I pay for these chains, it's a lot. Stop talking money if you really don't got it. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it. Nigga, stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop playing with that man. Nigga, I already know what the deal is, nigga. Yeah, I should already know by now. Don't play with him. We're not the ones to play with. What is money? Don't make us throw it up in the air and walk away. Put a price on your head on a sticky pad. Stop playing. Stop playing with that man.
Yap gangsters in the building. Yap gangsters back. Japanese still. You can cook the front of your family like a Japanese meal. It's Yashuda Hibachi, and none of you niggas can stop me. On today's episode, we're going to be dealing with a particular work that I have referenced in times past, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. So we're going to be reading some material today, going to get into the literature, going to get into the works, and the reason why this work is pertinent because it's an eye opener and it gives a perspective that's rarely taught or exposed, on the internet, social media. So, on this channel, I try to educate you guys to the best of my ability. What's interesting about this book, it talks about the characteristics of what we call black, or what we label or deem blackness. Is actually redneck culture and behaviors that we learn through being around rednecks, being around Southern Dixiecrats, Democrats, being around these very violent, uneducated peoples, and we start to pick up their lingo, we start to pick up their behaviors, and has really existed and persisted. It has persisted into today's Black American population. I know people going, "Oh, I want to hear that." No, well, yeah, what you guys largely celebrate as Black culture, are Black vernacular, or Black behavior, or what have you. It is largely inherited from redneck culture, and that's what this book talks about, and how white liberals exacerbate this and they encourage this. So we're going to get into it. Um, Without no further ado, let's get straight to the nitty gritty. But before we do that, I would like to read the fair use, because we are protecting the fair use. Look at copyrighted material. The fair use pretty much says Section 107 of the Copyright Act provides the statutory framework for determining whether something is a fair use and identifies certain types of uses such as criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. So we're going to be giving critiques, commentary. We're going to be reporting on this, of course, teaching, scholarship, and research. We're going to be doing a culmination of all these things today. So we are covered under the Fair Use Act. So we're able to bring out this material. All right. Oh, we're well within our right. So from there, let's go directly into the book. If I can find it, let's see. Thomas Sowell, Black Rednecks, and it should be here. Hold on. StreamYard, Mozilla Firefox. So let's see. For some reason it doesn't want to show up. So let me close this out and then go back to sharing the file. Okay, share screen. Window. There it is. Rednecks and white liberals. So I own this via Google Play Books. And this is the title, as you can see, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. All right. Has a quote here in the beginning in the epilogue. It says, "We do not live in the past, but the past is in us," by U.B. Phillips. And this is true. Even, towards the topic here, the topic being Black rednecks. We don't technically live in the 1800s or the early 1900s. We technically don't live in those times, but the things from that time period, shalom, my brother James, the things from that time period still persist and exist in our extant populations, mainly the Black American population. So that's what we're going to be covering. This is why U.B. Phillips' quote is powerful. "We do not live in the past, but the past lives in us." We have the dregs of a more racist past persisting in Black Americans. This is where we get a lot of our racial attitudes from. Like I pointed out, I'm highly critical of the BHIs because they pretty much took the KKK's playbook, the Southern Dixiecrat playbook, and reverse engineered it to fit their own agenda. But it's the same thing. It's same miscegenation, same racial discrimination, racial condemnation based off a racial schema that was given to us by Germans. It's the same exact thing. It's white supremacy, just reversed. So, again, powerful quote. We do not live in the past, but the past is in us, because things that happen in the past persist and exist in today's populations. And we're going to be mainly focusing on Black Americans, right? True story and all those guys. Oh, we don't deal with history here. Yes, we do. We actually bring out the history here. It's just that it's not palatable to a lot of Black people because it's not intriguing, or it doesn't sound good. It's like medicine. It's like bitter medicine. It's hard to swallow, right? But you need the medicine to cure your ailments, right? And the ailment that we're trying to cure is racism, recidivism, and a lot of the counterproductive ways of our people. and we have to address the history of where this comes from so we can eradicate it at the root. All right, so let's get into the preface. I always read the preface of a book because it tells you why the author wrote the book, gives key elements of the book, and it's just very pertinent to your understanding of the book, right? So it says here, race and rhetoric have gone together for so long that it's easy to forget that facts also matter. And that's another thing. So before we continue reading, that's pretty much our social climate. Everything's about race, and they give rhetoric for it, to the point where we don't even look at the facts of the matter. Like, for instance, people say, well, black people do certain things because they're black. No, black people are in the situations they're in because of cultural differences, mainly. Not because they were born that way, or they were born to fail, or they were born to be less educated. It's because the environments they live in are not conducive for the education or for the economic progress of these people. Um, One key element being born into single parent homes. Um, like Obama said years ago, a child that is born in a single parent home is 9 to 12 times more likely to be incarcerated, right? And now you're in a house that doesn't have a two earner potential. Now they're not getting all of the financial aid that they would get in a two-parent home. They're not getting the attention they would get in a two-parent home. A lot of stuff goes into that. So it's not because you're born black or you're born with a certain phenotype these things happen. But if you listen to CNN or MSNBC or critical race theory, you would think that you would come to that conclusion because it's race and rhetoric and it has nothing to do with the facts of the matter. The facts of the matter, the reason why black people do bad or poorly or perform poorly in this country is because their environment and their culture is not conducive to do those things. I just wanted to point that out because, again, that's the fact that liberals do not want to tell you, because if they tell you that, then that lets you know that, hey, I can actually overcome these things because it's in my control. It's not something that is inherent in my DNA or who I am. And that's the message that needs to be taught to our youth and to our people, because at the end of the day, these things can be overturned and be changed within a generation or two. It's not inherent. It's not something that's prepackaged in us. It's something that we have control over, and that's what the facts come into to play. It says, and these facts often contradict many widely held beliefs. That's the thing. The facts about reality pretty much destroy race. Here's another thing about race and rhetoric. You can have black and white people having the same ancestors. That destroys and contradicts many widely held beliefs, because some people have a binary contradictory model where they feel like black people are black people, white people, they have nothing to do with each other. But if you go just 100 years ago, some of these black Americans would, go back to white ancestors. You understand? So the facts actually destroy a lot of these many widely held beliefs. Um, it says fantasies and fallacies about racial and ethnic issues have had a particularly painful and deadly history. So exposing some of them is more than an academic exercise. The history of intergroup strife has been written in blood in many countries around the world and across centuries of human history. The purpose of this book is to expose some of the more blatant misconceptions poisoning race relations in our time. The reason for these misconceptions range from simple, innocent ignorance to reasons that are far from simple and far from innocent. So what he's saying is some people just believe this because they're ignorant, and we do encounter people like that, right? But some of it's pretty much designed to do so, like CRT, what the liberals are doing. They're using race as a method to get black compassionate votes that can pass their policies. They always bring up race, like the LGBTQ community. They're bringing up race. Oh, black people are dying. They try to get you emotionally involved and let you vote with your emotions and not your brain, so they can pass laws that allow them to indoctrinate your children with LGBTQ. Allow them to say, "Hey, we don't want capitalism no more. Communism, socialism is actually good," and they're using black plight and black struggle as a impetus to gain support on these things, So a lot of these things are designed at using our people and abusing our people and pimping our people for the vote. And they're using race because black people get all choked up and emotional about it because of their history here in this country. Let's continue reading. It says many of the facts cited here may be surprising, even startling to some readers, but they are not literally unknown to scholars. They have simply not been widely discussed in the media or even in academia. So this is why it's important that we take out our time as a community and read and study and understand these things, because again, this is not widely available. This is not proliferated. Um, yeah, exactly, James. Because liberals created the environment that way and want to keep us where we are at. Exactly. These are the same people that existed 100 years ago, 200 years ago, same policies being reiterated and remixed and repackaged. That's all it is. They believe that slaves were, properties of the state, and the state had complete control over them, and they gave them housing, food, clothing, and shelter. It's the same thing they're trying to do with the welfare state. Same thing they're trying to, and what that does is that limits your economic mobility, um, and you're not able to challenge the government, or you're not able to have economic freedom because the government controls the amount of money you have, control where you live and what you eat. Right? That's pretty much the reality of slavery. All right, so let's continue reading. So it says here, too much has been assumed for too long, and too little has been scrutinized. It may be optimistic merely to suggest that racial or ethnic issues can be discussed rationally. Evidence to the contrary is all too abundant, and in the strident, sweeping condemnations directed against many who have tried to do so. Let me give some commentary here. Um, well, this is pretty much evident in social media. If you try to bring these things up, people will ostracize you for even trying to critique these long held beliefs and motifs of how they think race works and how people are due to race. For instance, an example of this, there's a long held belief that black people can't be racist, and that's not true at all. You can exhibit racism, and you can practice in racism. It doesn't matter what skin color you is. This ideology that's counterproductive for any society, and black people are capable of doing so. All right. That's just one of the many. We can stay up here for 10 hours talking about many of these long held beliefs that they won't allow you to even speak on because it's sacrament to the culture and sacrament to the people that you're speaking to, and they won't allow you to speak against it. Um, let's continue reading. It says, yet there is also evidence in recent years of growing willingness to consider views that differ from the racial orthodoxy that has prevailed largely unchallenged from the 1960s onward in intellectual circles and in popular media. In any event, these essays summarize the conclusion of more than a quarter of a century of my research on racial and cultural issues, as well as drawing on the work of innumerable other scholars around the world. These writings do not pretend to be definitive. If they provoke thoughts on a subject where cliches and dogmas too often prevail, then the book will have achieved one of its major goals. So, again, this is why you read the preface. One of the goals, um, get rid of these cliches and dogmas that often prevail, right? It says, however, even a work seeking primarily to untangle a complex set of historic social issues can provoke the fashionable question, but what is your solution? And that's what people always ask you. Well, what is your solution? Because real quick, before we continue reading, I have to say, uh, yeah, thank you, Sean. You will never reach your potential economic value by waiting for the government to help you. That's very true, man. Yap gang in the building, source gang, yap. That's very true. It's like once you let the government control all aspects of your life, there's no way they're gonna give you a limit because they believe in a two class system, uh, rich and poor, and they want to keep you under as an underclass, and they have been successful at keeping Black Americans in that area because again, when you don't have any economic prospects, job participation going on, and no one's promoting that, you're going to continue to be an underclass. You have no economic freedom, no buying power, no nothing. Okay. um but back to this point here in the book. once you start bringing these things up, people will criticize you, say, but what is your solution? So this is a Messiah complex kicking in. Like, if I'm talking about an issue, I got to have a solution for everything. No, the point is to bring forth awareness so we can generate solutions. If we can't have the conversation, how are we going to have the solutions? Because you're never allowing the conversation to happen in the first place. You just want to, come on here and, try to lambast someone that's trying to bring awareness to an issue that a lot of you guys ignore anyway, right? So let's continue reading here. It says here, but what is your solution? Yet there is not the slightest danger that there will be a shortage of solutions. On the contrary, an abundance of uninformed solutions has been one of our biggest social problems. Any serious consideration of social problems is likely to involve trade-offs rather than the neat solutions. And trade-offs depend on values which can vary from one individual to the next. And I also want to talk about this trade-off concept because I put something on Facebook that was incendiary to some of the people on Facebook. And it was like, well, black successful women, they're largely unmarried. So they should date outside their race. And people got upset by that. But that's a trade-off, right? Anyway, race is not a biological thing at all, even though we look at it like it's about, oh, you're betraying your ancestors. You don't even know if that person is related to you or even share the same ancestors. The whole point is to get away from this social scheme for the better good of the community, so we can produce better communities, right? So there's more economic mobility and more progress in education. That's the whole point, not to keep up with a color code, right? So that's one of those trade-offs, right? That he's mentioning here. Because when you have solutions, you're going to have trade-offs. Like when many people say, "Oh, well, you're abandoning the black community. These people abandon the black community." That's one of the trade-offs. That they're leaving the ghetto, or they're leaving some of the roughest areas in America to live in a more middle class, sustainable area, and it understandably so, right? And people get mad at people for that, but all the rappers talk about it. Everybody in the hood, one of their main goals is to get out of the hood. That's just reality. Who wants to live in squalor? Who wants to live below the poverty line? Nobody. And this is why it's so ironic when you get people that live in the suburbs that try to imitate people that live in the ghetto. It's like, Negro, we're trying to get where you at. You're trying to be a gangbanger. These gangbangers trying to get out the hood and live, in White Plains. For people that's new to the channel, White Plains is my arbitrary title for the suburbs. They live in White Plains. They live in in these good areas that don't suffer from a lot of the issues that we find in inner urban cities and inner urban villages, or excuse me, in the urban parts of America, right? So let's continue reading. It says here, with what trade-offs others might make after considering what these essays have to offer is not something that can be predicted, nor is such a prediction necessary. There is still much to be said for the ancient adage, with all you're getting, get understanding. If this book can contribute to understanding on a subject where misunderstandings abound, then it will have done its work. Because this book is written for the general public, it does not feature long, convoluted sentences with escape clauses designed to prevent words from being twisted to mean something that they were never intended to mean. Common sense can be more readily expected when writing for the general public than in writing for intelligentsia. To prevent the words in this essay that follow from being stretched, twisted, or given clever meanings, let me state here and now that these essays do not mean that all Southern whites were or are rednecks, that all Black Americans today or in the past were or are Black rednecks, that Jews are exactly the same as the other groups with whom they are compared, or that slavery is somehow morally acceptable because everyone was guilty of it. So he's laying it out here in his book so no one can go around and defame him and say, "Oh, your book teaches that all Black people are rednecks." No, this book doesn't. He says it in his preface. He says it in his preface. It's not saying that all whites are rednecks. It's not saying that slavery is morally acceptable. It's not saying none of these things. So he's laying it out in the beginning so no one stretches and twists it, because you know how the left is and you know how people are when they're upset. They try to straw man your argument instead of dealing with what was actually discussed here. It says one cannot predict, much less forestall, all the clever misinterpretations that others might put on one's words. The most that can be done is to alert honest people to the problem. While this book is not particularly large in bulk, its scope is worldwide and goes back through centuries. No one can write a book of such scope without incurring many debts to others. These include scholars who devoted much of their careers to the study of some particular speciality, such as the history of agriculture in the southern United States or the origins in Britain of various social groups in America. Such debts are too numerous to list here, quite aside from the danger of implicating other writers in conclusions which are my own. What must be acknowledged is my debt to Hoover Institution, which has provided the conditions and the support which has facilitated my research and writing for more than 2 decades. For much of that time, my research assistant, Na Liu, has been an indispensable part of my work. And for this particular book, she has been very ably assisted by the dedicated work of Elizabeth Costa. In the end, however, I must and will take full responsibility for the conclusions reached in the essays that follow. So that's Thomas Sowell's preface. Again, always read the preface of the book because it tells you why the author read the book and the intentions of the actual work. So let's get into the meat and potatoes. Black rednecks and white liberals. These people are creating a terrible problem in our cities. They can't or won't hold a job. They flout the law constantly and neglect their children. They drink too much, and their moral standards would shame an alley cat. Now, before I finish this quote, who do y'all think this quote's talking about? Who is this quote referring to? Because when you first read this, you were like, oh, that's talking about black people. That's talking about black Americans. Let's read the rest of it. This is an actual quote that from times past. Let's read it from the top. It says, these people are creating a terrible problem in our cities. They can't or won't hold a job, right? So these people are jobless. These people don't, they don't participate. There's no job participation room. That's one of the keys of a successful community, job participation. It says they flout the law constantly and neglect their children, meaning these people operate outside the law and they don't take care of their children. So as soon as you read this, the first red flag is, oh, these people don't take care of their children. These are black American males. And they operate outside the law. These are black American males, right? This is what is going through your mind because of the social climate that we live in, right? It says they drink too much and their moral standards would shame an alley cat. Again, the same thought process here in this quote. It says, for some reasons or other, they absolutely refuse to accommodate themselves to any kind of decent, civilized life. End quote. This is how he opens this book. Now, let's figure out, who is he referring to? What is this quote referring to? This was said in 1956 in Indianapolis, not about blacks or other minorities. So this particular quote has nothing to do with blacks or other minorities, even though people will associate these things with blacks or other minorities, right? Maybe like Mexicans or something. Let's see what it's actually talking about. Let's continue reading. But about poor whites from the South. These are talking about rednecks. So again, what is the title of this book? Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And what he paints in this book, in the narrative that he shows, is that a lot of our negative attributes, we learn them. Because again, we're not born with these attributes. You learn these behaviors as you are living, while you're living, right? And a lot of the Negroes, majority of the Negro population was in the South, and we were surrounded by these indignant people known as rednecks, Southern Democrats that were very racist. A lot of them, they operated outside of the law. That was a cartoon called Hillbilly Bears or something like that. It was about two families trying to kill each other, which many can argue that's the antecedents to gang banging, how black people kill each other, right, at record levels. So a lot of these, behaviors and that we witness with Black Americans persist from this era and these peoples. And as we can see, this quote is from 1956, and again, it's talking about they refuse to hold a job. They operate outside the law. They neglect their children. They drink too much, and their moral standards with shame and alley cat. And this is talking about poor whites from the South when in 1956 in Indianapolis. It says, nor was Indianapolis unique in this respect. A 1951 survey in Detroit found that white Southerners living there were considered undesirable by 21% of those surveyed, compared to 13% who ranked blacks the same way. In the late 1940s, a Chicago employer said, frankly, I told the guard at the plant gate to tell the hillbillies that there were no openings. So they were refusing to hire these people because the way they behaved themselves. It says when poor whites from the South moved into northern cities to work at war plants during the Second World War, occasionally a white Southerner would find that a flat or furnished room had just been rented when the landlord heard his Southern accent. More is involved here than a mere parallel between blacks and Southern whites. What is involved is a common subculture that goes back for centuries. So I'm gonna give some commentary here. This shows you again. This has nothing to do with biology. It has nothing to do with how you were born, where you were born, or who you are in the womb at the molecular level. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with the environment and the people that we were around and where we learn this type of behavior from. It's a subculture that we gain from being around rednecks and racist Dixiecrats of times past. So let's continue reading. It says, what is involved is a common subculture that goes back for centuries, which has encompassed everything from ways of talking to attitudes towards education. That's going to be a big point there. Because what do we see in the Black American community now? They neglect education. They speak down on education, right? This is the same thinking of the rednecks. Same exact thinking. It says violence and sex. Another key point. What do we already learn about their behaviors? That these men do not take care of their children. They're having sex. They're indiscriminate sex. They're not taking care of their children, right? And the violence aspect again. These hillbillies were very violent. Like Hanna-Barbera made a cartoon about it, about how violent hillbillies were. I think it's the Hillbilly Bears is what it was called. I'll look it up a little later. And they were just constantly into it with each other, killing each other, fighting each other, shooting at each other. It says, in which originate not in the South, but in those parts of the British Isles from which white Southerners came. So even this subculture goes back to the British Isles. It goes back to Britain. And these people that were from Britain came all the way over and became the Southern planters, right? Came to the Americas. That culture long ago died out where it originated in Britain, while surviving in the American South. Then it largely died out among white and black Southerners while still surviving today in the poorest and worst of the urban black ghettos. It is not uncommon for a culture to survive longer where it is transplanted to retain characteristics lost in the place of origin. The French spoken in Quebec and the Spanish spoken in Mexico contain words and phrases that have long since become archaic in France and Spain. Regional German dialects persisted among Germans living in the United States after those dialects had begun in Germany itself. A scholar specializing in the history of the South has likewise noted among white Southerners archaic word forms, while another scholar has pointed out the continued use in that region of the terms that were familiar at the time of the first Queen Elizabeth. The card game, which is today played amongst exclusively by blacks, especially low income blacks, though in the 18th century it was played by the British upper classes and has since then evolved into bridge. The history of the evolution of this game is indicative of much broader pattern of cultural evolution and much more weighty themes. Southern whites not only spoke the English language in very different ways from whites in other regions, their churches, their roads, their homes, their music, their education, their food, and their sex lives were all sharply different from those of other whites. The history of this redneck or cracker culture is more than a curiosity. It has contemporary significance because of its influence on the economic and social evolution of vast numbers of peoples, millions of blacks and whites, and its continuing influence on the lives and deaths of residual population in America's black ghettos, which has still not completely escaped from that culture. So this is the point of this book, and this is why I wanted to bring it out on the channel, is that a lot of this stuff that gets celebrated, um, yeah, thank you, James. Black people did not act like that in the 50s and 70s at all. You had black people that believed in family, that believed in education. You had black people that were not like these southern rednecks. But in today's time, it has become the dominated culture, and many could argue it's because the situations in the cities we live in, and the politicians, they pretty much are feeding our people this culture and exacerbating this culture, right? And the whole purpose of bringing this out is we have to be aware of the issue to solve the issue, right? Let's truncate and remove this culture from our communities because it has had nothing but a negative impact on our communities. All right. Let's continue reading. It says here, from early in American history, foreign visitors and domestic travelers alike were struck by cultural contrasts between the white population of the South and that of the rest of the country in general, and of New England in particular. In the early 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville contrasted white Southerners with white Northerners in his classic Democracy in America, and Frederick Law Olmsted did the same latter in his books about his travels through the antebellum South, notably Cotton Kingdom. Real quick side note here, antebellum just means before war, and that's what ante means. Before bellum, I believe, is Latin for war. And what war they're referring to, Civil War, right? That's what antebellum means. Let's continue reading. It says, they, Tocqueville, set a pattern when he concluded that almost all the differences which may be noticed between the Americans and the Southern and the northern states have originated in slavery. Olmsted likewise attributed the differences between white Southerners and white Northerners to the existence of slavery in the South. So when I'm going to continue reading this, but I want to give commentary here. When we're talking about the legacy of slavery, a lot of these Democrats will throw this buzzword out there, the legacy of slavery. You're mainly talking about these Southern racists and these Dixiecrats and these Democrats. These people were Democrats, Jacksonian Democrats. So they're mainly talking about their party when we're talking about the legacy of slavery. Because again, we get our sex habits, our behaviors, our cultural patterns. We get a lot of these things from these racist people known as rednecks or Democrats from the South. It says, so did widely read antebellum Southern writer Hinton Helper, who declared that slavery and nothing but slavery has retarded the progress and prosperity of our portion of the Union. Why are quotes like this important? Because what identity politics have taught us is that all black people are the same, all white people are the same. But as we can clearly see, there was people that were not in agreement of slavery. They were not in agreement with the politics of the South. They were not in agreement with the culture, the subculture of the South, right? Hence, that's why we had a war in the first place, known as the Civil War. It says, just as they explained regional differences between whites by slavery, so many others in the latter era would explain differences between blacks and whites nationwide by slavery. Plausible as these explanations might seem in both cases, they will not stand up under a closer scrutiny of history. It is perhaps understandable that the great overwhelming moral curse of slavery has presented by attempting a causal explanation of the peculiar subculture of Southern whites, as well as that of blacks. Yet this same subculture has existed among Southern whites in their ancestors in those parts of the British Isles which they came long before they had ever seen a black slave. So yes, the culture existed before, persisted, but it persisted in the South, is what he's saying here. That The nature of this subculture among people who are called rednecks and crackers in Britain before they were ever saw America needs to be explored before turning to the question of its current status among ghetto blacks and how developments in the larger society have affected its evolution. All right, so now we're going to move on to the next segment of the book, Redneck Culture. Immigration from Britain, like other migrations around the world, was not random to either its origins or its destinations. Most of the Britons who migrated to colonial Massachusetts, for example, came from within a 60-mile radius of the town of Haverhill in East Anglia. The Virginia aristocracy came from different localities in southern and western England. Most of the common white people of the South came from the northern borderlands of England, for centuries a no man's land between Scotland and England, as well as from the Scottish Highlands and from Ulster County, Ireland. All these fringe areas were turbulent, if not lawless regions where none of the contending forces was able to establish full control and create a stable order. All these fringe areas were turbulent, if not lawless regions where none of the contending forces was able to establish full control and create a stable order. What does this sound like? Where these white people are coming from? It sounds like the Black American ghettos, the inner urban city. A lot of people in these areas choose to operate outside of the law, and it's pretty unruly, and the culture there is very pervasive and counterproductive. We see the roots of this. It's actually coming from Ireland, in these Scottish Highlands and different places of England. This is where it's coming from. And unfortunately, we fell victim to this culture because these were the slave masters and slave owners, these people who were around, and our children and generations after absorbed it from these people, right? Let's continue reading. It says, whether called a Celtic fringe or North Britons, these were people from outside the cultural heartland of England, as their behavior on both sides of the Atlantic showed. Before the era of modern transportation and communication, sharp regional differences were both common and persistent. In some of the counties of colonial Virginia, from nearly 3/4 to 4/5 of the people came from the northern Britain, and similar proportions were found in some of the counties of Kentucky and Tennessee, as well as parts of both of the Carolinas. Although they predominated in many parts of the South, such people also had some northern enclaves in the colonial America, notably western Pennsylvania, where Ulster Scots settled. What is at least equally important as where particular people settled is when they immigrated from the borderlands, Ulster, and the Scottish Highlands. Scotland, in particular, progressed enormously in the 18th century. The level from which it began may be indicated by the fact that a visitor to the late 18th century Edinburgh found it noteworthy that its residents no longer threw sewage from their chamber pots out their windows into the street, something that passerbys had long had to be alert of to avoid being splattered. So it was just throwing, they were throwing their feces out their windows. Such crude and unsanitary living had long been characteristics of earlier times when rural Scots lived in the same primitive shelters with their animals and vermin abounded. A similar lack of concern with cleanliness was found among others in the borderlands of Britain and among their descendants on the other side of the Atlantic in the antebellum South. For example, a 19th century politician, open quotes, built up a political machine in the poor white districts of Mississippi, close quote, by such practices as this. He did not resort to any conventional tactics of kissing dirty babies, but he pleased mothers and fathers in log cabins by taking their children upon his lap and searching for bed bugs, lice, and other vermin. So before we continue reading, these people coming from these areas of Scotland and Britain, very disgusting people, vile people that had a subculture, right? It's very important to note these, man. It's the reason why he's going through this history, because he's trying to unravel the origin of this subculture. Okay. It says back in British Isles, the life of Scottish people was transformed dramatically from the masses to the elites, as they advanced from being one of the least educated to one of the most educated peoples in Europe. However, what is significant here is that much of the migration to the American South occurred before these sweeping social transformations. These times were crucial, as Professor Grady McWhiney has pointed out in the book Cracker Culture. Had the South been peopled by 19th century Scots, Welshmen, and Ulstermen, the course of Southern history would doubtless have been radically different. 19th century Scottish and Scottish Irish immigrants did, in fact, fit quite comfortably into Northern American society. Significantly, the Irish who retained the Celtic ways did not. But only a trickle of the flood of 19th century immigrants came into the South. The ancestors of the vast majority of Southerners arrived in America before the Anglicization of Scotland, Wales, and Ulster had advanced very far. So again, before this revolution or intellectual revolution hit these different areas, many of the people that lived in the South of America were coming from these places where they were still throwing feces out their windows, where they had a subculture where these people operate outside the law, and they didn't really encourage education. Right, these will be your early planters, the people that we would have been surrounded by during the times of slavery in the antebellum South. Let's continue reading. It says, in earlier centuries, Scotland was a poor and backward country like Wales and Ireland, and like the turbulent northern borderlands of England, where the Scots and the English fought wars and committed atrocities against each other for centuries. Local feuding clans and freebooting marauders kept this region in the uproar. What does that sound like? That sounds like that is analogous to what we see with the Bloods, the Crips, the GDs, the BDs, Vice Lords, etc., etc., etc. The Woos and Chews. Like this culture being self-destructive and going and feuding and killing each other, these long-lasting 40-year feuds, like the 8 Trey Gangsters and the Roller 60 Crips, was already going on 100, 200 years prior to them, 300, 400 years prior to them even existing in England and Scotland and in these different areas, right? Because that's the type of behavior this subculture carries. It's a very violent one. So it says local feuding clans and freebooting marauders kept this region in an uproar, even when there were no military hostilities between the English and Scottish kingdoms. So this didn't have anything with the military. These are the local people just operating outside the law and acting a fool. It says Ulster County had a different kind of turbulence as the English and Scottish settlers there encountered the hostility and terrorist activities of the conquered, dispossessed, and embittered indigenous Irish population. These were the parts of Britain from which most people migrated to the American South. These are the people that was migrating to the American South. So it's no wonder where we get this culture from, this black ghetto culture from. It's coming from these people. The people that had a subculture, the people that were known for local feuding, operating outside. These are criminals, disgusting criminals. These are the people that fostered the black American culture. The negative black American culture, I should say. It says, before the political and cultural unification of the British Isles or the standardization of the English language, the rednecks of these regions were what one social historian has called, open quote, some of the most disorderly inhabitants of a deeply disordered land, close quote. These are the people that pretty much owned our ancestors in the South, raised our ancestors in the South, and you can clearly see how we got this. All right. So let's continue reading. It says, in the world of impotent laws, daily dangers, and lives that could be snuffed out at any moment. What does that sound like? In this world of impotent laws, daily dangers, and lives that could be snuffed out at any moment, it sounds like the ghetto. It says the snatching at whatever fleeting pleasures presented themselves was at least understandable. Certainly, prudence and long-range planning of one's life had no such payoff in this chaotic world as in more settled and orderly societies under the protection of effective laws. So in this world, people's like, what's the point of even living long? What's the point of being planning? Because most of us can't even survive to 25. Haven't we heard that about Black American youth in the ghetto? This was going on long before Black American youth in Baltimore or Los Angeles and Dallas or in New York, or Boston or in Dorchester. Long before that, you had these white people, these rednecks, living out this culture, making their cities a living hell. It says certainly prudence and long-range planning of one's life had no such payoff in this chaotic world as in more settled, orderly societies under the protection of effective laws. Books, businesses, technology, and science were not in the kinds of things likely to be promoted or admired in the world of the rednecks and crackers. So when we see this culture being pervasive in modern Black American culture, where we don't respect books, that we don't promote businesses or create businesses, or we don't promote technology and science, there's an anti-science, anti-book, anti-literacy pervasive culture in the Black community. This existed with these rednecks first, so we know where this mode of thinking comes from. Right, James. The outcasts of Scotland who would be supervising plantations in the Americas, right? And they're carrying this culture, this attitude of anti-science, anti-technology, business and books, and they're carrying this attitude, and they're teaching our ancestors these ways, right? Let's continue reading. It says manliness and the forceful projection of that manliness to others, and advertising of one's willingness to fight and even put one's life on the line. What that sound like? I'm gonna ride, I'm gonna slide. All these words, you catch phrases like this was already going on long before there was a Chief Keef, long before there was a Suge Knight, long before there was a Draco the Ruler, long before these people even existed. They already had this mentality. I'm gonna fight. I'm gonna die about mine. All these sayings, right, that we hear circulate, Black popular media or rap or whatever. This stuff existed long before that. It says where at least plausible means of gaining whatever measure of security was possible in a lawless region in a violent time. The kinds of attitudes and cultural values produced by centuries of living under such conditions did not disappear very quickly. Even when social evolution in North America slowly and almost imperceptibly created a new and different world with different objective prospects, what the rednecks or crackers brought with them across the ocean was a whole constellation of attitudes, values, and behavior patterns that might have made sense in the world in which they had lived for centuries, but which would prove to be counterproductive in the world to which they were going, and counterproductive to the Blacks who would live in their midst for centuries before merging into freedom and migrating to the great urban centers of the United States, taking with them similar values. So these values of violence, our ideology on sex, our ideology on books and science and businesses, we're learning these negative traits and values from these rednecks that come from Scotland and Britain, these outcasts, and they became the plantation owners, and they became the people and population that we would absorb culture from. Let's keep going. The cultural values and social patterns prevalent among Southern whites included an aversion to work. This is a cultural and social pattern prevalent among Southern whites, including aversion to work. So when we talk about Black people are lazy, or Black male don't want to have job participation, that type of culture, that type of mode of thinking is something of the Southerner. That's something of the Southern white redneck. This is why the book is called Black Rednecks and White Liberals. He's giving you the origin of these negative traits and who they come from. An aversion to work, proneness to violence. First thing you want to do is slap somebody, put your hands on them, want to put a bullet in them. The old trope, he stepped on my shoes. Do what you do, but watch my shoes. You can get loose, but watch my shoes. Because people are dying over the littlest things. The smallest things. They're dying over the smallest things. Simple infraction that somebody, all you had to say was, excuse me, my bad, my fault, man. You know what, man, let me pay. You know what I'm saying? Those things can easily be squashed. But no, these Southern whites had a culture where they were prone to violence. What we see in the Black ghettos in the urban cities. Neglect of education. Oh, I ain't going to school, man. School is, I grew up in a school where if you sounded like you understood the material, you got clowned. by your peers. It's a negative thing to be educated. Oh, you trying to be white, which we're gonna cover that too in this book, where that comes from, that origin. You trying to be white. So we have a neglect, we have a culture that neglects education, and we know where it comes from. Sexual promiscuity. We know where that comes from. Over sexualization of our teens and our kids, making them, making it acceptable for them to experience sex at an early age. Now we got the teen pregnancy phenomenon going on. We know it comes from Southern rednecks as well. Improvidence, drunkenness, lack of entrepreneurship. What do we say about the Black American community? We don't have enough people creating businesses. And we know business create jobs. This also comes from the Southern redneck. Reckless searches for excitement. I mean, that goes without saying. Lively music and dance. That goes without saying. Partying. And a style of religious oratory marked by strident rhetoric, unbridled emotions, and flamboyant imagery. So when you see that pastor go crazy at the Baptist church, yelling and screaming, "You gonna get your blessing," and all that, and then shaking and dropping on the ground, and that comes from Southern whites as well. Falcons fan forever says, "I always wanted to read this book, brother. I'm glad you're showing it to us." Yes, this is a very insightful book. I think everyone should. This should be on everyone's bookshelf. And I'm gonna tell y'all something. Black Americans should be reading this because when I was up north working, I do service work, so I'm in a lot of people's homes. I'm looking at their bookshelves. I always look at their bookshelves. Every white person I worked, almost every, let me say almost every, right? White person's home that I worked in, they had Thomas Sowell's books on their shelves. Like Thomas Sowell's books are very popular within, middle class whites. I don't know why, but I always saw his books on their shelves. So do yourself a favor and purchase at least one of his books and get an understanding because he covers a lot of ground. And it's pertinent to know where this culture comes. It's important that we learn where this culture comes from. So again, back to the church point, when you see like holiness churches acting a fool, everybody jumping up, dancing, yelling, and screaming, that comes from the Southern churches, man. Southern white churches. This oratorical style carried over into the political oratory of the region in both the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era, and has continued on into our own times among Black politicians, preachers, and activists. Touchy pride, vanity, and boastful dramatization were also part of this redneck culture among people from the regions of Britain where the civilization was the least developed. Among people from the regions of Britain where civilization was the least developed, they boast and lack self-restraint. This is the culture. These are the traits of these people. These outcasts of Britain, these people that operate outside the law in Britain. Olmsted said after observing their descendants in the American antebellum South. And we know where these people came from. We know the culture that they carried over with them. They had the culture over there. They brought it to the Americas with them. The lack self-restraint. I don't care. I'm like Dre Hughes did an interview. He said he's a certified tweaker, and if someone touch him, he knocking them out. There's no self-restraint. You already telling yourself in your mind that you going to jail. You have no self-control. This Black ghetto culture is coming from somewhere, and it's coming from rednecks. Let's continue reading. It says, while Professor Grady McWhiney's crackers culture is perhaps the most thorough historical study of the values and behavioral patterns of white Southerners, many other scholarly studies have turned up very similar patterns, even when they differ in some ways as to the causes. Professor David Hackett Fisher, Albion Seed, for example, challenges the Celtic connection connection thesis, but put forth by Professor McWhiney, but shows many of the same cultural patterns among the same people, both in Britain and in the American South. Popular writings of the 19th and 20th centuries have likewise described similar behavior, including the Indianapolis residents' comments on white Southern migrants to that city. which sounds so much like what many have said about ghetto blacks. None of this is meant to claim that these patterns have remained rigidly unchanged over the centuries or that there are literally no differences between whites and blacks in any aspects of this subculture. However, what is remarkable is how pervasive and how close the similarities have been. So the next segment is pride and violence. Centuries before Black pride became a fashionable phrase, there was a cracker pride. And it was very much the same kind of pride. It was not pride in any particular achievement or set of behavior standards or moral principles adhered to. It was instead a touchiness about anything that might even remotely construed as a personal slight, much less in a so combined with willingness to erupt into violence over it. And I want to comment on this, and I know people in the chat might want to comment on this. Saying anything about blacks and them needing to change their behaviors and violence will ensue. They want to put their hands on you. I'll smack you. Someone told me on Clubhouse, can't wait to see you in traffic, pussy. That was his words. All over a discussion on how we could be better parents or, be involved in our kids' lives or, be better towards our women. So he's right about this. This black pride that we have is not it's not having pride in positive things. It's not having pride in progress. It's having pride in the negative things we do. I had someone try to argue me down that, oh, well, we don't need the nuclear family no more. I was like, what do you mean? He was like, oh, because I get by just fine. Yeah, you're a male and you go work and you take care of business. Yeah, you yourself get by, but what about your son? What about the woman that you made a mother before a wife? What about how she's doing? She's probably struggling. We need the nuclear family. We don't need a bunch of 70% of us being single parents. We don't need that. We see the effects of it. We see the consequences of it in our day-to-day lives. So he is absolutely correct here. Before there was Black Pride, there was Cracker Pride, and the similarities of both of them is it's like, oh, if you say anything about black people, then I'm gonna bust your head. If you say anything about crackers, I'm gonna bust your head. That's how it is. Violence ensues. So let's get back to this book right here. It says New Englanders were baffled about this kind of pride among crackers. Observing such people, the Yankees could not understand what they had to feel proud about. However, this kind of pride is perhaps best illustrated by an episode reported in Professor McWhiney's Crackers Culture. When an Englishman, tired of waiting for a Southerner to start working on a house he had contracted to build, hired another man to do the job, the enraged Southerner, who considered himself dishonored, vowed, tomorrow morn, I will come with men and 20 rifles, and I will have your life, or you will have mine. Well, that sounds like some thug culture right there. He said he gonna show up since you're not gonna give me the job, even though the man gave him the job. He just took too damn long to actually do the work. He said, since you did that, saying I'm dishonored, and tomorrow I'm gonna show up with 20 of my niggas with guns, and we're gonna see who wins. You know what I'm saying? We're gonna see who come out alive. That sounds like some ghetto gang banging stuff, some ghetto thug life stuff, man. What Tupac when you need a thug life? But these are white rednecks saying this. Let's continue reading. It says, in the vernacular of our latter times, he had been dissed, and he was not going to stand for it, regardless of the consequences for himself or others. And this is what we see pervasive in the black ghettos. This is why murder is so high. Like 90%, I believe 90% of our murders that happen in black communities remain unsolved. A lot of people don't know that. 90% of them remain unsolved. Let's continue going. It says the history of the antebellum South is full of episodes showing the same pattern, whether expressed in highly formalized duels of the aristocracy, or in the no holds barred style of fighting called rough and tumble. Among the common folk, a style that included biting off ears and gouging out eyes. It was not simply that particular isolated individuals did such things. Social approval was given to these practices as illustrated by this episode in the antebellum South. A crowd gathered and arranged itself in an impromptu ring. The contestants were asked if they wished to fight fair or rough and tumble. When they chose rough and tumble, a roar of approval rose from the multitude. And this is akin to how we live in these black ghettos where people want to fight. They chant fight, fight, fight. They want black people to fight each other, put hands on each other. There's a gruesome video that circulates the internet where two girls were fighting, and one of the girls slammed the other girl on the concrete on her head. But first thing people want to do is record it, put it on phone, put it on their phone, put it on social media. This is redneck culture that we're displaying here. Let's continue reading. It says this particular fight ended with the loser's nose bitten off, his ears torn off, and both his eyes gouged out, after which the victor himself, maimed and bleeding, was changed round the grounds to the cheers of the crowd. This rough and tumble style of fighting was also popular in the southern highlands of Scotland, where grabbing an opponent's testicles and attempting to castrate him by hand was also an accepted practice. These are the people that our ancestors were around and learning from. These are the people. Exactly. Yep, exactly, James. Everyone got around and create a ring and make them fight in the hood. Yeah, this is where it comes from. These people from Scotland and the British Isles. It says here, Scottish Highlanders were in centuries past part of the Celtic fringe or Northern Britons outside the orbit of English culture, not only as it existed in England, but also in the Scottish lowlands. The Highlanders lagged far behind the Lowlanders in education and economic progress, as well as in speaking of the English language. For Gaelic was still widely spoken by Highlanders in the 19th century, not only in Scotland itself, but also in North Carolina and in Australia, where immigrants from the Scottish Highlands were enabled to communicate with English speaking people, including Lowland Scots, who had also immigrated in the Hebrides Islands off Scotland. Gaelic had still not completely died out in the middle of the 20th century. What is important in the pride and violence patterns among rednecks and crackers was not the particular people did particular things at particular times and places, nor is it necessary to attempt to quantify such behavior. What is crucial is that violence growing out of such pride had a social approval. As Professor McWhiney pointed out, men often killed and went free in the South just as in earlier times they had in Ireland and Scotland. As one observer in the South noted, enemies would meet, exchange insults, and one would shoot the other down, professing that he had acted in self-defense because he believed the victim was armed. When such a story was told in court, in a community where it is not a strange thing for men to carry about their persons deadly weapons, each member of the jury feels that he would have done the same thing under similar circumstances, so that in condemning him, they would but condemn themselves. So again, this is the culture, very violent, killing people over insults, killing people over, like today we have something that's very pervasive in our youth is they're going on Twitter, they're going on Instagram, threatening each other. And then some of these people are ending up dead, and some people go back on Instagram and pretty much claim the body. This is how bad it's gotten, but this is the root of it. This is where it comes from. It says the actions of Southern courts often amaze outsiders. Professor McWhiney said, but what may be even more revealing of widespread attitudes were the cases that never even went to trial. As another study of white Southerners put it, too many rural Southerners rather than a set of legal statutes. Justice remained a matter of societal norms, allowing for respect of property rights, individual honor, and a maximum of personal independence. Any violation of this pattern amounted to a breach of justice requiring a specific response from the injured party. Upon learning that a youthful neighbor had approached his wife in an overly friendly manner, Robert Leard of Tangipahoa, Louisiana, promptly tracked the young man down and killed him. Under the Piney Woods Code of Justice, anything less would have invited shame and ridicule upon the Laird family. Intensity of personal pride was connected by Olmsted with the fiend-like street fights of the South. He mentioned an episode of public murder with impunity. A gentleman of veracity now living in the South told me that among his friends he had once numbered two young men who were themselves intimate friends, till one of them, taking offense at some foolish words uttered by the other, challenged him. A large crowd assembled to see the duel, which took place on a piece of prairie ground. The combatants came armed with rifles, and at first interchange of shots, the challenged man fell disabled by a ball in the thigh. The other, throwing down his rifle, walked toward him and, kneeling by his side, drew a bowie knife and deliberately butchered him. The crowd of bystanders not only permitted this, but the execrable assassin still lives in the community, has since married, and as far as my informant could judge, his social position has been rather advanced than otherwise from thus dealing with his enemy. What does this sound like? These are actual historical events going on in the South. We praise the murderer in our songs. We praise the murderer in our communities, right? We praise these people. We glorify these people. That's what was going on in the South. They're glorifying these people, and these murderers were walking around free. I remember working in Dallas County. We were working on apartments, getting them made ready for inspection. And yeah, don't say do what you do, but don't watch my shoes. Yeah, we working on the inspection, and the guy that was on Crime Stoppers for a murder was walking free in the damn in the projects. And we're like, why is this guy walking free? Why is nobody calling the cops on him or nothing? Mainly because he's probably respected there. And if you say something, you do something, you probably gonna get hurt. They respect the shooter. Where does that culture come from? These people here that we're reading about. All right, so let's go back. Again, what is important here is not the isolated incident itself, but the set of social attitudes which allowed such incidents to take place publicly with impunity. The killer knowing in advance that what he was doing had community approval. Moreover, such attitude went back for centuries on both sides of the Atlantic, at least among the particular people concerned. During the era when dueling between a pattern among upper class Americans between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, it was particularly prevalent in the South. As a social history of the United States noted, of Southern statesmen who rose to prominence after 1790, hardly one can be mentioned who was not involved in a duel. Editors of the Southern newspaper became involved in duels so often that cartoonists depicted them with a pen in one hand and a dueling pistol in the other hand. Most duels arose not over substantial issues, but over words considered insulting. And that's what's going on with our black youth right now. It's the same thing. Oh, he insulted me. He dissed me. He said this about. He sneaked. That's another word. Sneak dissing. He sneak dissed me. When I see him, it's up. That's what they say. It's up there and it's stuck there. So these people are killing each other over insults. Not anything too deep. You know, nothing too deep here. Simple insults, and we see this in the ghettos, and we know where it comes from. These people that were doing this in Scotland and doing this in the Highlands of Britain prior to coming over here, and they brought that culture with them. Let's continue reading. It says that lower social level, Southern feuds such as that between the Hatfields and the McCoys, which began in a dispute over a pig and ultimately claimed more than 20 lives, became legendary. It has been estimated that while at least 3/4 of the settlers in colonial New England originated in the lowland southeastern half of Britain, a similarly large proportion of the population of the South originated in the Scottish Highlands, Ireland, Wales, or the northern and western uplands of England. Those arriving from Ireland in colonial times would have been from Ulster County, where Scots and Englishmen settled, since substantial immigration of the indigenous Irish did not begin until near the middle of the 19th century. Radically different cultures could develop and persist during this era before transportation and communication developed to the point of promoting widespread interaction among people in different regions. In colonial America, the people of the English borderlands and of the Celtic fringe, were seen by contemporaries as culturally quite distinct and were socially unwelcome. Mob action prevented a shipload of Ulster Scots from landing in Boston in 1719. So these people didn't want them here. That's why when you try to say all whites are all blacks the same, this is the problem. These white people did not want these undesirable whites coming into their cities. They're like, hell no, send that ship back over there. We already know what they about, and we ain't got time for it, right? It says, and the Quaker leaders to the eastern Pennsylvania encouraged Ulster Scots to settle out in western Pennsylvania, where they acted as a buffer to the Indians, as well as being a constant source of friction and conflict with the Indians. It was not just in the North that crackers and rednecks were considered to be undesirables. Southern plantation owners with poor whites living on adjoining land would often offer to buy their land for more than it's worth in order to get rid of such neighbors. What we call that today, gentrification. They were trying to gentrify these people even back then. Like, listen, we don't want them in our communities. We don't want them poisoning the well, so to speak, right? They're like, we'll buy your land for more than it's worth to get your ass up out of this neighborhood. They're talking about other white people here. They're talking about people from the British Highlands and Wales and Scots. But well, no, these people right here, these people, they have no moral code, man. These people are lawless. These people are going to burn this community down to the ground. We can't have them here. They were gentrifying their ass. Back then, it says because there were no racial differences to form separate statistical categories for these North Britons and for other whites who settled in the South or in particularly enclaves elsewhere, indirect indicators must serve as proxies for these cultural differences. Names are among these indicators. Edward, for example, was a popular name in Virginia and Wessex, England, from which many Virginians had immigrated. But the first 40 classes of undergraduates at Harvard College contained only one man named Edward. It would be nearly 2 centuries before Harvard enrolled anyone named Patrick, even though that was a common name in Western Pennsylvania where the Ulster Scots settled. This says something not only about the social and geographic differences of the time, but also about how regionalized the naming patterns were then, and the contrast of the fact that no one today finds it particularly strange when an Asian American has such non-Asian first names as Kevin or Michelle. Even where there was no conflict or hostility involved, Southerners often showed a reckless disregard for human life, including their own. For example, the racing of steamboats that happened to encounter each other on the rivers of the South often ended with exploding boilers, especially when the excited competition led to the tying down of safety valves in order to build up more pressure to generate more speed. An impromptu race between steamboats that encountered each other on the Mississippi illustrates the pattern. On board one boat was an old lady who having bought a winter stock of bacon, pork, etc., was returning to her home on the banks of the Mississippi. Fun lovers on board both boats insisted upon a race, cheers, and drawn pistols obliged the captains to cooperate. As the boats struggled to outdistance each other, excited passengers demand more speed. Despite every effort, the boats raced evenly until the old lady directed her slaves to throw all the casks of bacon into the boilers. Her boat then moved ahead of the other vessel, which suddenly exploded. Clouds of splinters and human limbs darkened the sky. On the undamaged boat, passengers shouted their victory, but above their cheers could be heard the shrill voice of the old lady crying, "I did it! I did it! It's all my bacon." So these people are very destructive, very low regard of human life, and these motifs still exist today in the Black ghetto. So on the Mississippi and other western rivers of the United States, as they existed in the early 19th century, it has been estimated that 30% of all the steamboats were lost in accidents. Part of this may have been due to deficiencies in the early steamboats themselves, but much of it was due to the recklessness which they were operating on southern rivers. The comments of a firearm on a Mississippi steamboat of the era may suggest why a river voyage was considered more dangerous than crossing the Atlantic at a time when sinkings in the Atlantic were by no means rare. Um, Open quotes, talk about northern steamers. The fireman of a Mississippi steamboat sneered to an Eastern traveler in 1844, and don't need no spark to navigate the waters. You hain't bust a biler in 5 years. But I tell you, stranger, it takes a man to ride one of these half alligator boats, hand on a stag, high pressure valve, soldered down, 600 souls on board, in danger of going to the devil. Close quote. It says, this was not mere idle talk. Among the steamboat explosions in the South, one in Mississippi in 1838 killed well over 100 people, and another near Baton Rouge in 1859 killed more than half of the 400 people on board and badly injured more than half of the survivors. Southerners were just as reckless on land, whether on uh, escapades undertaken for the excitement of the moment or in the many fights and deaths resulting from such some insult or slight among people touchy about their honor and dignity. Again, all this went back to the way of life in the turbulent regions of Britain from which white Southerners came. Nor is it hard to recognize in these attitudes clear parallels to the behavior and attitudes of ghetto gangs today, who kill over a look or a word or an action that can be construed as dissing them. And as we see today, even in popular culture and rap, you see certain rappers getting shot and killed. Mo3 from Dallas got killed. There's so many rappers getting shot and killed. It's crazy over disses and beefs and Draco getting stabbed at a concert in the neck, killing him. And those are just the famous ones, but we know this goes on all the time in the hood. Slim 400 getting shot and killed over dissing, and they said he was on Instagram dissing people. Like, this is where this culture comes from. Let's keep reading. It says, pride had yet another side to it among its definitions of a cracker. In the Oxford Dictionary is a braggart, one who talks trash in today's vernacular. A wisecracker. More than mere wisecracks were involved, however. The pattern is once said by Professor McWhiney to go back to descriptions of ancient Celts as boasters and threateners and give it to bombastic self-dramatization. Examples today come readily to mind not only from ghetto life and gangster rap, but also from militant black leaders, spokesmen, or activists. What is painfully ironic is that such attitudes and behavior are projected today as aspects of distinctive black identity. And we got to stop this real quick. I'm going to continue reading this. I'm going to finish it. But we got to stop using violence and these negative traits and saying, oh, that's black culture. That's black culture. I'm going to stand by it. No, it's not. This is actually British and Scottish culture. And not all of British and Scotland, but the negative side of Britain and Scotland. The cracker and redneck side, right? So, as we can see, redneck culture is very pervasive today in the black ghetto because as we've read many examples of how these people were feuding, killing each other, had a low regard of life, their ideas, their ideals, and how they were against science, they were against education, they were basically against anything that would forward-thinking people would be promoters of. Let's continue reading. It says, what is painfully ironic is that such attitudes and behavior are projected today as aspects of distinctive black identity, when in fact they are part of centuries-old pattern among the whites in whose midst generations of blacks lived in the South. Any broad brush discussion of cultural patterns must, of course, not claim that all people, whether white or black, had the same culture, much less to the same degree. There are not only changes over time, there are cross currents at a given time. Nevertheless, it is useful to see the outlines of a general pattern, even when the pattern erodes over time and it varies among different subgroups. The violence for which white Southerners became most lastingly notorious was lynching. Like other aspects of the redneck and cracker culture, has often been attributed to race or slavery. In fact, however, most lynching victims in the antebellum South were white. Economic considerations alone would prevent a slave owner from lynching his own slave or tolerating anyone else doing so. It was only after the Civil War that the emancipated blacks became the principal targets of lynching. But by then, Southern vigilante violence had been a tradition for more than a century in North America, and even longer back in the regions of Britain from which crackers and rednecks came, where the retributive justice was often left in private hands. Even the burning crosses of the Ku Klux Klan has been traced back to the fiery cross of the old Scotland used by feuding clans. So all this stuff, it's going back to Scotland and Britain, where it originated from. And these white people came to the South, and they pretty much taught us these traits and these cultures, right, through behavior, right. So the next segment is economic activity. Observers of the white population of the antebellum South often commented not only on their poverty, but also on their lack of industrious or entrepreneurship. A contemporary characterized many white Southerners as too poor to keep slaves and too proud to work. A landmark history of agriculture in the antebellum South described the poor whites this way. They cultivated in a casual and careless fashion small patches of corn or rice, sweet potatoes, cowpeas, and garden products. Women and children did a large part of the work. The men spent their time principally in hunting or idleness. The men were inveterate drunkards, and sometimes the women joined them in drinking inferior whiskey. Licentiousness was prevalent among them. Among their equals, the men were quarrelsome and inclined to crime of violence. The poor whites were densely ignorant, so they were dumb, they were violent, and they were licentiousness. I mean, I think that's like sexual promiscuity, right? It says, continue reading. It says their labors tended to be intermittent, often when they were pressed for money rather than a steady employment career. Frederick Law Olmsted called it lazy poverty, when whatever work they did being done in thoughtless manner. Summarizing his observations in the antebellum South, Olmsted said, I know that white men seldom want an abundance of coarse food in the cotton states. The proportion of the free white men who live as well as in any aspect as our working classes in the North, on an average, is small, and that the citizens of the cotton states as a whole are poor. They work little, and that little badly. They earn little, they sell little. They buy little, and they have little, very little, of the common comforts and consolations of civilized life. The destitution is not material only, it is intellectual and it is moral. When Olmsted found work done efficiently, promptly, and well during his travels through the South, when he found well run businesses, good libraries, impressive churches, and efficiently functioning institutions in general, he almost invariably found among them to be run by Northerners, foreigners, or Jews. Nor was he the only visiting observer to reach such conclusions. Another observed that nearly all of the Old South successful storekeepers were either Yankees or Yankee trained Southerners. A French visitor said that when you saw a plantation in a better condition than others, you would often discover that it was owned by someone from the North. A history of Southern agriculture presented this picture of North Carolina in the early 18th century. Many of the inhabitants were rough borderers who lived a crude, half-savage existence. Some were herdsmen, dependent mainly on the product of the range and under the necessity of eating meat without bread. There was also many thriftless and lazy families who had been attracted to the country by the mild climate and the ease with which a bare livelihood could be obtained by hunting and fishing, raising a little corn, and keeping a few head of swine and possibly a cow or two on the range. On the other hand, there were small farmers, many of the northern or European extraction, living industrious and thrifty lives amidst a rude abundance and considerable diversity of food supplies. They maintained good-sized herds of cattle, swine, and sheep, and the women made butter and cheese. Borderers at the point will refer to people from the borderlands of Britain. Those included in what Professor McWhiney and others have called the Celtic fringe, and what Professor Fisher called North Britons. While the making of the butter and cheese might seem to be an unremarkable activity in most rural communities, butter and cheese making by these farmers of non-southern origins was in fact exceptional in the South. One of the Frederick Law Olmsted complaints during the travels through the antebellum South was the scarcity of butter, despite all the cows he saw. Even among plantation owners, he said, as far as for butter, some have heard of it, some have seen it, but few have eaten it. Hard data supports his conclusions about the scarcity of butter in the antebellum South, despite an abundance of cows. In 1860, the South had 40% of all the dairy cows in the country, but produced just 20% of the butter and only 1% of cheese. A study of antebellum Southern agriculture noted attempts to stimulate greater attention to commercial production was futile. And even the bluegrass regions imported a large proportion of the cheese consumed, the study concluded. So before we continue on, they were too damn lazy to create cheese and butter in the South. So where do we get these motifs and ideas and cultural traits of black people being lazy and not being advantageous as far as industrious or entrepreneurs? We get it from these people from the Celtic fringe. We get it from these white Britons, these rednecks, or quote unquote crackers, as Thomas Sowell calls them in his book. That's where we get it from. All right, so let's continue reading. It says, in short, while the South abounded in cattle, the reported production of dairy products was very small. A table based on census statistics shows that some of the southern states, such as Texas and Florida, had far more cattle per capita than important dairy states like Vermont and New York. And most of the southern states' cattle per capita were nearly or quite as numerous as in northern states. Yet the production of butter and cheese per capita in most of the southern states was insignificant as compared with per capita production in principal northeastern states. A speaker before an agricultural society in Orange County, North Carolina, said, it is a reproach to us as farmers and no little deduction from our wealth that we suffer the population of our towns and villages to supply themselves with butter from another Orange County in New York. In colonial times, butter was imported from as far away as Ireland, where butter was not imported. It was often produced locally by people of non Southern origins, as a scholarly history of Southern agriculture reported. In 1858, the dairies producing whole milk for the city of Louisville, Kentucky, were described as probably as well conducted as any in the country, but almost without exception managed by Swiss or German operatives. Meanwhile, a newspaper in South Carolina said in 1857, good butter is indeed a luxury to almost every planter in the southern country, and there is perhaps no one article of food that is more eagerly sought after. In antebellum Virginia, a Richmond newspaper likewise complained of the scarcity of good butter, saying that the quality of butter available in the local market would hardly be thought good enough to grease a cartwheel. When considering legislation to try to remedy the situation, a member of the Virginia legislature attributed the poor quality of the state's butter to the carelessness with which Virginia farmers prepared it. One reason for the contrast between the abundance of butter and cheese produced by German farmers in the states like Wisconsin, for example, and the scarcity of butter and cheese in the South was the German farmers, wherever they were located, tended to build fences and huge barns for their livestock and to feed them there during the winter. Southerners more often let their cows and hogs roam freely during the winter, even though this meant that in the spring they turned up half starved and it took the summer for them to put on normal weight. This too was a continuation of patterns found among their ancestors in the British Isles and was part of a more general pattern of carelessness. Many other observers noticed that the broken fences and the stunted cattle running at large, unfed and unprotected, their manure was put to no use. Artificial pasture long remained a rarity, and few farmers stored feed for the winter. In Virginia, a French traveler of the late 17th century saw poor beasts of a morning, all covered with snow and trembling with cold, but no forage was provided for them. They eat the bark of the trees because the grass was covered. Wild animals, wolves, bears, and savage dogs attacked the helpless cattle and made the raising of sheep difficult. Germans were better able than Southerners to milk their cows regularly and prepare dairy products, while cows owned by Southerners were more likely to run dry after cows were weaned. A contemporary observer said that even Southern farmers with many cows will not give themselves the trouble of milking more than will maintain their family. This again, let me just give some commentary here. And these motifs, these ways of living, these modes of thinking, has persisted and is pervasive in the Black American community today. And this is where it comes from, this laziness, this carelessness. I just need enough to get by. No, you need to make a surplus. Our ancestors were making surplus. Our ancestors were agrarian. They were known for surplus. They were known to be advantageous. They were known to be industrious even back then, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So that's what we need to get back to. We need to truncate and remove this white redneck culture that has been preventing us from being successful in several fields. and pick up the skills and trades and the behavior patterns that will be conducive to our economic growth, and our mental growth and our physical growth. All right. Let's continue reading. It says, as late as the 1930s, a scholar studying the geography and economy of the South wrote, the close attention to duty, the habits of the steady, skillful routine accepted by butter and fat producers of Wisconsin, as a matter of fact, are traits not yet present in Southern culture. At that point, the Southern states, with 26% of the country's dairy cows, produced just 7% of the processed dairy products, such as butter, cheese, ice cream, and condensed milk. There was a similar contrast between German farmers and Southern farmers when it came to clearing land for farming back in pioneering days. Germans cleared frontier land by both chopping down trees and laboriously removing their stumps and roots so that all the land could be plowed thereafter. Southerners more often cut down a tree or even simply girdled it and left it to die and rot, but in any case, leaving the stump in the ground and plowing around it. That's just lazy, man. Let me keep reading. It says, although the erosion-prone soils of southern uplands have been blamed for the poverty of the whites living on them, nevertheless, on the same land, Germans were able to cultivate the hill soil so as to avoid erosion and were willing to expend upon it the additional labor which its topography required, so that these soils in their hands yielded excellent regular returns. Comments on the lack of enterprise by Southern whites were made by numerous observers in various parts of the South. In Alexis de Tocqueville's classic Democracy in America, he contrasted the attitudes toward work among Southern and Northern whites as being so great as to be visible to the casual observer sailing down the Ohio River and comparing Ohio side with the Kentucky side. These were not just the prejudice of outsiders. No Southern man, South Carolina's famed Senator John C. Calhoun said, not even the poorest or the lowest will, under any circumstances, perform menial labor. He has too much pride for that. Now, who does that sound like? Who does that sound like? These are traits that we have in the black community. I'm too good for that. I'm not going to do, I don't care how poor I am. I'm not going to go to school. I'm not going to get the skills. I'm not going to get the job. I'm not going to do these things that lift me out of poverty. I'm too good for that. Now, oh, you work for the slave man. I'm too good for that. These behaviors, this mode of thinking comes from these whites that come from the Celtic fringe. We keep reading. General Robert E. Lee likewise declared, our people are opposed to work. Our troops, officers, community, and press all ridicule it and resist it. What does that sound like? And again, the three things that make a community successful: family, education, job participation. But you have these people, they were against job participation. They were opposed to work. They even ridiculed work, and that's what's going on in a black social sphere now. You have a lot of people, oh, you trading your time for money. You working for a white man, working for somebody else. Even if you're an entrepreneur, you're going to be working for somebody. I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm working on getting my business established now. And my boss or my bosses are going to be my clients. I'm going to be working for them. And I'm still going to be trading time for money because I'm going to go out and do jobs, and it's going to take time to do so. So the ridicule doesn't make any sense. It's just a bunch of people trying to be complacent with being poor and be complacent with whatever economic status that they have, which is a bad attitude to have if we're trying to pull ourselves out the mire. But this is where it comes from. Even General Robert E. Lee said this. See, y'all know who General Robert E. Lee is, right? So our people are opposed to work. Our troops, officers, community, and press all ridicule and resist it. Many whites, according to a leading Southern historian, were disposed to leave good enough alone and put off changes till tomorrow. So I'll get to it tomorrow. I'll get to it eventually. That's basically what they're saying. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll put it off till tomorrow. This is that lazy ass thinking that comes with this redneck culture. Since very similar kinds of comments were made about the Southerners' ancestors in the parts of the British Isles from which they came. Although the term lazy appears frequently in comments on these people on both sides of the Atlantic, there's There has been no evidence of any such aversion on their part of strenuous physical activity and dancing, fighting, hunting, and other recreational activities. So sloth was not the real issue. So these people, they will find the energy to dance, like black people to find the energy to go to clubs and all that other stuff, right? Rap or whatever. Fighting, they got all the energy in the world to fight, hunting, and other recreational activities. Anything they're going to do for fun, they got the energy for it. But when it comes down to working and doing something constructive, now they want to do it. Let's keep reading. It says, nor have rednecks or crackers been prominent in such less physically demanding activities as entrepreneurship or scholarship. It is the nature of the particular activities in which they have taken an active interest in and on which they have expended their energies rather than the physical demands of those activities that seem to have been crucial. Not only did many of the groups who settled in the South disdain business as a career, as their ancestors had in those parts of Britain from which they came, they typically lacked the kinds of habits necessary to be successful in business. Among the habits needed to run a business, none is more basic than a steady application to the task at hand, doing things in a business-like way. But those relatively few Southerners who did run businesses often displayed no such business-like attitudes. Even when there were businesses to transact, Southerners would often stop to go watch a cockfight or a parade, or visit a saloon or go hunting. And traveling in the South, a Northern visitor commented in the 1850s, you become astonished at the little attention men pay to their businesses. Such views were not confined to Northerners, however, nor to urban businesses. According to a noted history of the antebellum South, the Richmond Inquirer attributed the success of Northern farmers where Southerners had failed to the social nature of the latter, which led them to gather around the courthouse and country stores to smoke, chew, talk politics, and in general to waste time. Sound like a damn barbershop, if you ask me. I'll keep reading. It says many Southern businessmen were unreliable about either paying their bills or delivering goods and services when promised. What does that sound like? What does that sound like? A lot of people with these t-shirt businesses, you got to damn near cuss them out to get your damn shirt, to get your product. With these black businesses, they don't want to deliver their businesses. They don't want to deliver their products on time. They don't want to execute customer service. This is where this comes from. There's a lot of similarities here. So what you're calling black culture or saying is distinctive black culture is actually redneck culture. That's what this book is pointing out. It's doing a great job of doing it. It says among Southerners in general, their improvident spending and the indebtedness to which is often led was widely commended on the United States and in the places from which their ancestors came in Britain. So these people would pretty much live beyond their means. They would spend more money than they had, and they would end up in debt. This is self-explanatory here. So even large Southern plantation owners with lavish lifestyles were often deeply in debt. Among the Virginian gentry, extravagant and even ruinous bets on horses were common according to the scholarly study. Nor were Southerners alert to profitable investment prospects according to the observers in the antebellum South. For example, although there were large coal deposits and a beautiful quality of marble near Tuscaloosa, Alabama, the people there brought coal from Philadelphia and marble for tombstones were imported from Italy. In antebellum Virginia as well, Olmsted observed the natural resources of the land were strangely unused or were used with poor economy. Nor was he alone in that conclusion. A 20th century scholar also commented on the coal available in Alabama. The Alabama Iron District is one of the cheapest, and not the cheapest, iron district in the entire world. It possesses a phenomenal natural equipment. Jutting out of the hillstones that flank one side of the broad open valley are thick deposits of iron ore. On the other side of the valley are coal mines and coke ovens. And the limestone is at hand instead of carrying ore 8,000 miles as at Pittsburgh in the English furnaces, or fuel 600 miles as at Lake Champlain. The raw materials for these southern furnaces are shifted across the valley by switching engines, and the local supply of cheap black labor helps to give a wonderfully low cost. Yet it was more than 20 years after the Civil War before Birmingham became an iron and steel production center. As for the reasons for the belated development of such a promising combination of natural resources, in spite of the favors of geography, the iron and steel industry in the South was slow in its beginnings in development. Like everything Southern, the industry was retarded by a lack of capital and technical skill. And what does that sound like? What's holding the black community back from progress? A lack of capital and technical skill. So again, the similarities run too deep here. Let's keep reading. It says capital was available from outside the South, or indeed from outside the country, as foreign capital was used to finance the building of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Illinois Central during the same era. But the other factors had to be there to create a promising prospect of profitability that would attract investment. The difficulties of developing those other factors in Alabama was shown by the fact that in 1888, Birmingham saw its first ton of steel run through the furnaces of the Henderson Steel Company and burn out the crude furnace linings in the process. Early explorers and settlers in the antebellum South wrote in the glowing terms of the wild fruits, especially in the wild grapes of unusual size, which excited extravagant hopes of the development of wine industries. Yet early attempts to find a market of southern wine in Britain were ruined by the fact that a sample of the wine that was sent across the Atlantic spoiled in the musky cask in which southerners had carelessly shipped it. Later efforts to establish a wine industry in the South were undertaken by foreigners, French, German, and Portuguese. A German settlement in Missouri created a wine industry with an annual output of about 100,000 gallons. But the South as a whole produced less than one-fifth of the wine in the United States in 1849, and this was long before the development of the California wine industry. And I also want to do a side note right here. When we look at this, what was the key takeaway? They were careless. The white Southerners were careless in these industries. They didn't take advantage of their natural resources or the resources they had. So what happened? What did this lead to? I want the viewers to understand this. This led to people from the outside, foreigners coming in and taking advantage of those things. What do we see in these black communities? Chinese owning restaurants. They own the Ross Dress for Less. They own all these stores in these industries that our people feed into. But if we wasn't careless, and a lot of our people would use our capital and gain these skills, we could own those same businesses, and get the and reap the benefits of having those businesses. But we carry this culture from the Southern whites, these rednecks, that are careless, and we don't take advantage of what's around us. So foreigners come in that have the skill and have the capital, they take advantage of it. We need to turn that around, or we're going to end up just like the Southern whites. Oh, well, actually, we are. A lot of us have ended up like them, and we need to just reverse it. Let's continue reading. It says, as late as the beginning of the 20th century, there were still laments about the opportunities in the South missed by Southerners and put to use by outsiders with different patterns of behavior. Landowners in Alabama were said to have cheated themselves out of millions of dollars by failing to see the opportunities within their grasp, which lumbermen from the north and east seized by cutting trees and shipping the lumber around the world. Some Southerners along the Gulf Coast likewise spoke of the golden opportunities which they failed to grasp, of the numerous success of Northern and Eastern men, and lamented in passing the old school of gentlemen, the midday mint juleps, and the easygoing business methods. Some of these Southerners, however, seemed to prosper, working shoulder to shoulder with Yankees. Not only in the South, but in the communities from which the white Southerners had come in the Scottish Highlands and Ulster and Wales in the earlier era, most of the successful businessmen were outsiders. Even the poorest Highland Scots would not skin their horses when they died. Instead, Scots sold their dead horses for 3 pence to the English soldiers, who in turn got 6 pence for the skin's carcass and another 2 shillings for the hide. This was not due to a lack of knowledge of skinning. In early times when Scotland and England were at war, one of the atrocities committed by the Scots was skinning captured English officers alive. During the 16th century border feuds, the Johnson clan adorned their houses with the flayed skins of their enemies of the Maxwells. It was not the skill that was lacking, but the enterprise. Contemporary observers commented on another peculiarity of antebellum Southerners: fording rivers and streams instead of building bridges over them. Nor was the nor was this due simply to poverty. A biography of famed 19th century Congressman John Randolph of Virginia referred to the bridgeless streams in an area where elite families like this lived. Thomas Jefferson noted that he had to cross 8 rivers between the Monticello and Washington, 5 of which had neither bridges nor boats. This peculiarity was noted in other parts of the South and by observers in those parts of Britain from which Southerners came. Commenting on just how lazy Southerners were, one man noted that no Northern farmer would neglect to build a bridge over a stream that crossed his property. Indeed, two live Yankees would complete the work in a single day, but the Southerner planter will ford the creek lying between his house and stable a whole lifetime. The same complaint was made about Highland Scots, whose roads were equally bad as those in Ireland and Old South. In the 1790s, a minister noted that fords rather than bridges cross streams on one of the most heavily traveled roads in the Highlands road. From a desire to save labor or time, the ford is often attempted when the river is too high, and the consequences frequently fatal. So they would rather chance their life than build a bridge. Just build the damn bridge. Again, this is where we get our lazy mind state from. These racist whites, these rednecks. So again, it's necessary to emphasize that this culture with Southerners brought over from parts of Britain from which they came changed in Britain in the years after they left. But all this happened after the ancestors of rednecks and crackers had immigrated to American South from the outer regions of British society rather than from central England. So, the main takeaway from this, if you don't have the capital, if you don't go out to get the capital, if you don't get the skills, other people will do it from outside your community and come to your community and make money off of it, make bank and become rich. And we've seen this with the rednecks. We've seen it with our own communities in urban cities. Like black women love to buy weave and hair products, but they don't own the weave and hair product industry, right? They don't even own it. But other people come from the outside, come in, and they make money off of the enterprise. We got to get the skills, man. We got to get the skills and the capital to make these things happen. And that's going to require work. That's going to require sleepless nights. That's going to require research. That's going to require more of you. We can't be like these Southern rednecks that were lazy and enterprising and did not want to apply the skills. These people didn't even want to build bridges. And the Yankees were like, look, we could have built that bridge in a day. All right, let's go to the next segment. Intellectual activity. Given the historical background of crackers and rednecks in Britain, it could hardly be expected that intellectual activity would be a major interest of theirs in the United States. A study of 18,000 county records from the 17th century colonial Virginia showed that nearly half of all the white male Virginians were so illiterate that they could not sign their names and simply made a mark on legal documents, while the small Virginia aristocracy were often well educated, had an impressive collection of books in their homes. These books were typically imported from England rather than purchased from local bookstores. Thomas Jefferson complained that the area where he lived was without a single bookstore. As late as the census of 1850, more than 1/5 of Southern whites were still illiterate, compared to less than 1% of New Englanders. In the southern backcountry, levels of schooling were lower here than any other part of the United States, according to a landmark historical study, and there was no institution comparable to New England's town schools. Although the white population of the South was only 1/2 as large as that of the North, the total number of illiterate whites in the South in 1850 was larger than the total number of illiterates in the North. In the antebellum era, the total circulation of northern newspapers was more than 4 times the total circulation of southern newspapers. Moreover, many editors of the southern newspapers were themselves from the North. The North had 4 times as many schools attended by more than 4 times as many pupils. Children in Massachusetts spent more than twice as many years in school as children in Virginia. When it came to inventions, only 8% of the patents issued in 1851 went to the residents of southern states, whose white populations was approximately 1/3 of the white population of the country. Even in agriculture, the main economic activity of the region, only 9 out of 62 patents for agricultural implements went to Southerners. The cotton gin, perhaps the most crucial invention for the antebellum South, was invented by a Northerner. A Southerner said to the Frederick Law Olmsted, "The fact is, sir, the people here are not like you Northern people. They don't reason out everything so." Olmsted himself likewise concluded from his travels in the antebellum South that Southerners were greatly disinclined to exact and careful reasoning. As late as the First World War, white soldiers from Georgia, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Mississippi scored lower on mental tests than black soldiers from Ohio, Illinois, New York, and Pennsylvania. And this shows you, again, what we just read shows you it's not a genetic thing, it's a culture thing. Because where the culture didn't exist, black people were smart, outperforming white Southern whites, as we just read. It says at higher levels of achievement in contrast between the South and other regions was even more stark. A study of leading American figures in the arts and sciences in the first half of the 19th century found most clustered in the Northeast, while vast regions of the South, Virginia alone excepted, were without a single one. The kinds of statistical disparities found between Southern whites and Northern whites in the past are today often taken as evidence of proof of racial discrimination when such disparities are found between the black and white populations of the country as a whole, while others have taken such disparities as a sign of genetic deficiencies. Yet clearly, neither racial discrimination nor racial inferiority can explain similar differences between whites in the North and the South in the earliest centuries. This should at least raise questions about such explanations when applied for blacks of a later era who inherited the culture of white Southerners. So we get our ideas about intellectual properties from white Southerners as well, their lack of reasoning and stuff of that nature, and pursuing higher education. We inherited that culture. It's the culture. It's not necessarily racial disparity, because people always throw it out there, but it's actually the culture we need to get rid of. And it's not a genetic deficiency either. It's the culture. The culture is what's dragging us down and preventing us from being a great community, right? Next segment. I know this is going to piss a lot of people off: sexual activity. Oh, what's wrong with sex? What's wrong with me having sex? Let's get into it. Southern whites were as different from Northern whites when it came to sexual patterns as they were in other ways. Widespread casual sex was commented on by outside observers in both the American South and those parts of Britain from which Southerners had come. Here again, the greatest contrast is with New England, while pregnant brides were very rare in 17th century New England. They were more common in southern backcountry than anywhere else in the United States. A missionary estimated that more than 9/10 of the backcountry women at whose weddings he officiated were already pregnant. So that means premarital sex was more prevalent in the South than it was in the North. In this, as in other respects, the sexual customs of the southern backcountry were similar to those of northwestern England. Meanwhile, the region of England from which New Englanders came had the lowest rates of illegitimacy in England, just as their descendants had the lowest rates of illegitimacy in the United States. Women dressed more revealingly in the South, and both sexes spoke more freely about sex than was common in New England. In the 17th century, most Virginia girls found a husband by the age of 17, while in Massachusetts, the average age which women married was 23. In that era, fornication and rape were acts severely punished in New England. Rape was hanging offenses in New England, while in Chesapeake Bay colonies, it was sometimes punished less severely than petty theft. As with other North-South differences in sexual behavior have often been attributed to the existence of slavery in the South, due in this case to the opportunities which this presented for sexual exploitation of slave women. But again, history shows the same patterns among the same people and their ancestors in Britain before they had ever seen a black woman. In colonial Virginia as well, the sexual exploitation of white indentured servant girls was common before the slave population had grown large enough for white servant girls to be replaced by black women. So, summation of what was said here, the Southerners, the women, they dressed more revealingly. They were more open about sex, and most of their women were already pregnant before marriage even happened. They were open about sex, right? Which is a culture that we see that is heavily in the Black American community as well. All right, let's continue reading. Religion. Religious denominations practiced in the churches differed as between the crackers and rednecks of the South and those of the white population and the rest of the country. As in other things, the greatest contrast was with the role of religion in New England. This did not mean that there was uniformity across the South, for the Virginia elite tended to be Anglicans, and there was also Quakers in the South, for example, but most Southerners were either Baptists or Methodists. Those Northerners or foreigners who visited the South found the style and manner of religion among most white Southerners distinct and distasteful. These visitors viewed with contempt people who whooped and hollered, chewed and spit tobacco in church. Many Southern religious gatherings were not held in churches but at outdoor camp meetings, a style that went back to practices of the Southerners' ancestors in Britain. So too did oratorical style of Southern preachers in the behavior of their congregation, whether in churches or outdoors. Frederick Law Olmsted's description of a typical preacher in antebellum South noted that the speaker nearly all the time cried aloud at the utmost stretch of his voice, as if calling to someone at a long distance off, that he was gifted with a strong imagination and possessed of a good deal of dramatic power, that he had the habit of frequently repeating a phrase, and that he exhibited a dramatic talent that included leaning far over the desk with his arms stretched forward, gesticulating violently, yelling at the highest key, and catching his breath with an effort. Similar scenes were described as a century earlier in Virginia and at a camp meeting in Scotland where the preacher was sweating, bawling, jumping, and beating the desk. This melodramatic and emotional oratorical style could still be seen in 20th century America, not only in religious services, but also in politics, both among white Southern politicians of the Jim Crow era and among black leaders of the civil rights movement in the South, community activists in northern ghettos. By contrast, religious services in colonial Massachusetts developed what has been called the meeting and lecture approach, where the style of preaching was relentless cultivation of plain style. These address tended to the closely argued statements of great density, in which Puritans reasoned as relentlessly with their maker as did with one another. This intellectual approach to religion carried over into their daily lives. Even more than most people in their time, they searched constantly for the clues of God's purposes in the world. It was the impulse which led so many English Puritans to study nature with extraordinary intensity, which played a central part in the birth of modern science. Yeah, a lot of people don't understand that modern science actually comes from religious peoples. But anyway, that's a whole nother topic. It said there was a dark side to this intensity as well. The vast majority of persecution and execution of women on witchcraft occurred in New England. Quakers did not have the persecuted intolerance of Puritans, but they too had plain spoke religious meetings, also in contrast of melodramatic services among rednecks and crackers of the South. So when you see pastors jumping up and screaming and yelling, and the way they preach, these Southern pastors preach, they get it from these rednecks. So the Anglican services were likewise emotional, dramatic, and Anglicanism in the South was largely confined to the Tidewater region. Catholics too had a quieter service, though more formal than the Quakers, but there was little Catholicism in the South, where even Irish immigrants tended to become absorbed into the Protestant religions, just as the Scots tended to become absorbed into the Southern fundamentalist religions. The South was a region lacking the prerequisites for maintaining an educated clergy, as by both Presbyterians and Catholics. Anyone familiar with a religious practice among Black Americans today will realize the clear imprint of the white Southern pattern. Again, we see these same motifs within modern Black churches. Let's keep reading. It says, it was not just the Southern preachers who behaved differently from their counterparts in the other parts of the country. So did the congregation. While many of those listening to hellfire and damnation sermons were moved to extreme emotional reactions of fear, confession, and repentance, and many others took these sermons as dramatic performances of spectacles. And then young women and men often treated these religious gatherings as occasions for socializing and preludes to romantic encounters later. This pattern too went back to early centuries in Scotland, where while some of the camp meetings were groaning, sighing, and weeping for their sins, there was usually also a knot of young fellows and girls making assignations to go home together in the evening or meet in some owl house. While the keeping of the Sabbath as a day of free or worldly activities and amusements was common practice in many parts of the United States in century past, this was not the practice among the rednecks and crackers of the antebellum South. Southerners had fun on Sundays to the consternation of the northern observers. One of the strangest sights of the New England man on the visiting southern states is the desecration of the Sabbath, wrote a Yankee. In some of the cities, especially if a good number of the businessmen are from the north, the churches are tolerably well attended, there being but one sermon for the day. But even here in the afternoon and evening, as much devoted to amusements. Another northerner declared that in the South there is no Sabbath. They work, run, swear, and drink here on Sundays just as they do on any other day of the week. Many Southerners did not go to church at all or did so intermittently or when not distracted by other activities. Again, this was a pattern found among their ancestors in Britain. Among the reasons given by contemporaries for low church attendance among Southerners was that they often got drunk on Saturday night and were in no condition to go to church on Sunday morning. All right, so next segment is the Black Rednecks. Much of the cultural pattern of Southern rednecks became the cultural heritage of Southern blacks, more so than the survivals of African cultures, which they had not been in contact for centuries. Even in colonial times, most blacks on American soil have been born on American soil. Moreover, such cultural traits followed blacks out of the southern countryside and into the urban ghettos, north and south, where many settled. The very way of talking allowed it to be Christian, Black English, closely followed dialects brought over from the parts of Britain from which many white Southerners came. Though these speech patterns died out in Britain while surviving in the American South. So a lot of people say Ebonics is African, it's remnants of our ancient language. Yeah, you have certain words like jazz being Bantu, which means to dance, I believe. So that's where you get the music genre jazz from. There's different terms. Like when someone calls you a jive turkey, jive could actually be a Bantu word that means to make noise. That's what jive means. So you do have instances like that, but by and large, a lot of these words that we got, like chitlins and stuff like that, comes from Britain. It comes from these rednecks from Britain. Let's keep reading. It says, as such speech patterns will later die out among Southern whites and among middle class blacks while surviving in the poor black ghettos around the country. For example, where another northerner said, I am, you are, she isn't, it doesn't, and I haven't. A Virginian, even of high rank, preferred to say, I be, you be, she ain't, it don't, and I ain't. So these are where these speech patterns come from. We say, I be, you be, like even McDonald's. There was a satirical piece about McDonald's. Instead of saying I'm loving it, we be loving it, or we be loving it. Yeah, making fun of what we call black speech or whatnot, right? And we see where this comes from. It's actually redneck speech. So these Virginia speechways were not invented in America. They derived from a family of regional dialects that had been spoken throughout the south and west of England during the 17th century. From these same regions of England came such words as yaller or yeller for yellow, axe instead of ask, across for across, y'all for you, bow for boil, do for door, dough for door, this for this, and that DAT for that. So when you say dough, that actually comes from English. So putting the OR on it, that comes from rednecks as well. Many of these usages have long since died out in England, though the word chitlins for hogging trails continue to be used in some localities in England, even in the 20th century. So we even get the word chitlins from there, right? As such usage remained common among Black Americans, but no such words came from Africa, nor did the holiday Kwanzaa, which originated in Los Angeles. The slaves' customs of marking their marriages by jumping over a broomstick, a custom resurrected at a posh wedding among blacks in the 20th century New York as a mark of racial identity, was in fact a pagan custom in Europe centuries past and survived for a time among Southern whites. Complaints about the improvidence of whites in the South and of their ancestors in Britain before that were echoed in W.E.B. Du Bois' pictures of its fellow blacks in the 1890s. Probably few poor nations waste more money by thoughtless and unreasonable expenditure than the American Negro, and especially those living in large cities. Thousands of dollars are annually wasted in amusements of various kinds and in miscellaneous ornaments and gewgaws. The Negro has much to learn of the Jew and the Italian as to living within his means and saving every penny from excessive and wasteful expenditures. It was not, however, from the Jews or Italians that blacks had absorbed their culture. Du Bois' description of the spending habits of blacks in the 1890s was echoed by a contemporary observer, Jacob Riis, who said the Negro loves fine clothes and good living a good deal more than he does a bank account. So, again, this sentiment still echoes today. Um, we rather look like we got money than actually have money. We wearing Givenchy, Burberry, Gucci, what's the new shoe, Giuseppe's, and all these shoes and stuff. Thank you, James. Liberals repackaged poor white culture and sold it to black people. Yet they not evil. Yeah, they very evil, and they continue to exacerbate these issues in these cultures and say, "Oh, well, yeah, that's actually black culture." No, it's not. It's redneck culture, and it does nobody good, let alone us. Let me continue reading. It says, the Negro loves fine clothes and good living a good deal more than he does a bank account. Similar observations have been made by many others over the years inside and outside the black community. For the lower socioeconomic classes among blacks, Gunnar Myrdal, a description of them near the middle of the 20th century, still bore a remarkable resemblance to the description of Southern whites and their regional forebears in Britain, including less resourcefulness, disorganized family life, lax sexual morals, and recklessness with tendencies toward aggression and violence. Despite a generally sympathetic approach to the study of blacks in his landmark book, An American Dilemma, which has often been credited with a major influence on the advancement of civil rights, Myrdal also noted the low standards of efficiency, reliability, ambition, and morals actually displayed by the average Negro. He observed something of the devil may care attitude in the pleasure seeking of Negroes, and a general attitude in which life becomes cheap and crime not so reprehensible. Like other observers, Myrdal tended to attribute to slavery such aspects of black culture as the low regard for human life, when in fact antebellum whites had exhibited this same reckless disregard of lethal dangers, and so had their ancestors in Britain. Unlike many others, however, Myrdal also recognized the influence of the Southern white culture on the culture of blacks, pointing out that the general Southern pattern of illegality maintained this low regard for human life. So basically, Southerners as a whole operated outside of the law, right? And Negroes just absorbed that culture. He also noted that the so-called Negro dialect is simply a variation on the ordinary Southern accent, that religious emotionalism was borrowed from and sanctioned by religious behavior among whites. Yeah. So when you see the the pastor hooping and hollering, acting a damn fool, that comes from rednecks. The dialect, saying ax instead of ask, comes from rednecks. Chitlins, the word chitlins comes from rednecks. The way we speak, ebonics. In the South, and that the Negro trait of audaciousness is a characteristic of white Southerners too. He quoted black scholar and later statesman Ralph Bunchy. White Southerners employ many of the defense mechanism characteristics of the Negro. They often carry a chip on the shoulder. They indulge freely in commiseration. They rather typically, in a real Negro fashion, try to overcome a feeling of inferiority by exhibitionism, raucousnesses in dress, and exaggerated self-assertion. Although Dr. Bunchy presented these as parallels historically, it was, of course, the Southern whites who first had these patterns, reflecting patterns among their ancestors in Britain. And much of the literature on the black culture, however, the supposed influence of slavery has been far more sweepingly assumed in cultural influence of white Southerners, and their forebears in Britain largely ignored. Attempts to derive the black manner of speaking from slavery in its parallel among whites as an influence from black speech were answered by a Southern historian who asks, from whence came the draw of the people of the upper Great Plains and of the Blue Ridge, Smoky, and Cumberland Mountains, who had had little or no contact with the Negro? So he's basically saying white people already had this language. And the reason why black people had it, they absorbed it in the antebellum South from these white people. Another cultural historian of Southerners aptly observed that Southerners, white and black, share the bonds of common heritage, indeed a common tragedy, often speak a common language, however seldom they may acknowledge it. Half a century after Mardahl, another study of racial attitudes noted the intimidating ethnic style of many underclass black males and noted that nearly half of all murder victims in America were black and that 94% of them were killed by other blacks. Many of these killings were due to gang members who killed for such reasons as cause he looked at me funny, cause he give me no respect, and other reasons reminiscent of the touchy pride and hair trigger violence of rednecks and crackers in the earlier era. The neglect and disdain of education found among antebellum white Southerners has been echoed not only in low performance levels among ghetto blacks, but perhaps most dramatically in hostility toward those black students who are conscientious about their studies, who are accused of acting white, a charge that can bring anything from social ostracism to outright violence. So much attention has been paid to the questions of ability that few have looked at cultural attitudes. One of those who has its black professor and best-selling author Shelby Steele, who sees in many of these children almost a determination not to learn, even though once outside the school in their own neighborhoods, these same children learn everything. He drew from his own experience teaching at the university. So he basically saying like amongst these black people, it's like they're so averse to learning. It's like they try not to learn. Why? Because up here it says who are accused of acting white. Now from here, I'm going to stop sharing this, but we're going to go back to it. We're going to go back to it. Let me go to another book real quick. Let me go to another book. I'm going to go right back to that. We actually read here, man. We pro literacy here. I want to bring up real quick where that acting white came from real quick. And this is going to be the Oxford Handbook of African American Citizenship. Won't be long. Page 295. I'm going to dip into this real quick and then give you guys that backdrop because it needs to be said. Because a lot of people say, "Oh, you acting white, you talking white." This is where it comes from. So this is the book, the Oxford Handbook of African American Citizenship, 1865 to present, page 295. It says the prejudice against too much education was further fortified by the fact that even little education was a dangerous luxury for African Americans. Educated blacks risked being considered uppity and face violent sanctions from affronted whites. So white people will beat your ass if you were trying to learn and educate yourself in the South, right? So even speaking standard English was viewed by whites as a violation of acceptable racial etiquette. So white, that speaking like white, oh, you acting white about being smart or speaking properly, it came from Southern whites themselves. They said that about us because it was racial etiquette, meaning the only people that could speak like that would be white people, not black people. It's a very racist motif that a lot of our people echo themselves, letting you know that these ideas come from rednecks. And when people say that, I always point out that you are a black redneck. So let's go back to Thomas Sowell's book. All right, let's continue reading Thomas Sowell. It says here, so he talks about how these children almost have a determination not to learn, and he gives an example here in this quote. It says, "For some years, I have noticed that I can walk into any of my classes on the first day of the semester, identify black students, and be sadly confident that on the last day of the semester, a disproportionate number of them will be at the bottom of the class, far behind any number of white students of equal or even lesser ability. Statistical data substantiate these impressions. Black students typically perform academically below the level of those white students with the same mental test scores. In contrast to Asian American students who perform better than white students with the same test scores as themselves. In short, even though black students average lower test scores than either white or Asian American students, those test scores are not necessarily the sole nor perhaps even the predominant reason for lower black academic achievement. Indeed, it is possible that lower test scores may be a result of cultural attitudes and of actions of inaction over a period of years based on those attitudes more so than a cause of academic failure. While it has long been known that historically the average IQ of blacks has been about 85 compared to the national average of 100, what has not been so widely known is that the average IQ of blacks in the North was for years consistently higher than that of blacks in the South. Why? Again, I'm gonna give commentary here. The reason why, because the South, again, they were violent towards Negroes. They would not allow them to be educated, right? But in the North, that was not the case. We keep reading. A 1942 study of freshmen of black college found the superiority of freshmen from northern schools over those from southern schools was found to persist throughout the colleges. As already noted, black soldiers from some northern states scored higher on mental tests than whites from some southern states during the First World War. From the same era, European immigrants from the cultures where education was not a high priority for ordinary people, parts of Eastern and Southern Europe, for example, scored no higher on mental tests than American blacks. And in some communities, their children scored lower than northern black children attending the same schools. The low test scores of some European immigrant children cannot be automatically attributed to their being new to the United States. There have been settled communities of whites with test scores similar to those of blacks, where these have been culturally isolated people, such as inhabitants of the Hebrides Islands off Scotland, or people living in Tennessee mountain communities, hillbillies, or inhabitants of canal boat communities in Britain. In short, some kinds of cultures tend to produce lower mental test scores, whether the people of those cultures are black or white American or European. As someone has aptly said, the tests are not unfair. Life is unfair, and the test measures the results. No one chooses which culture to be born into or can be blamed for how the cultures evolved in the century past. So, again, the issue is the negative culture that black people have absorbed. We get rid of that, we can change things, right? Let's keep reading. In business ownership, as in other ways, the pattern among black Americans had followed the pattern of rednecks in earlier times, with people from other groups owning most of the businesses in black neighborhoods. We read about this earlier. Rednecks, they lacked the skill and capital, so since they didn't want to invest in the skill and then get the capital, other foreigners came in and reaped the benefits of those resources in their neighborhoods, right? It says some may try to explain the lack of locally owned business in the ghettos by racial discrimination or poverty, but as early as 1920s, there were numerous black-owned businesses in Harlem, the majority of which were owned by blacks from the Caribbean, not blacks from the American South, who were the majority population of Harlem. For the viewing audience, why is that? Why are black Caribbeans successful in Harlem, but black Americans that came via the Great Migration to Harlem are not? Here's the answer. The Caribbean blacks were not inundated with redneck culture. Southern blacks were, which this redneck culture was anti-education, anti-business, anti-entrepreneurship, right? Very violent. But the Caribbean blacks were not exposed to that. Therefore, they were quite apt to own businesses and be conducive to Harlem. A lot of people don't understand it. A lot of these places like in Harlem, early Harlem in the early 20th century, the successes of chocolate cities were due to Caribbeans. Why? Because they were not raised in a culture that is adverse to education, to adverse to business, to adverse to family. They were not lax on sex, right? All these things that hurt and harm a community. Again, the three things you need for a community: family, education, job participation. Those three things will help bolster the success of your community. All right, let's continue reading. And look, this kills anybody that has a black inferiority complex or a genetic argument, because these two peoples, black Caribbeans and African Americans, are genetically similar. But hey, different outcomes. Why? Because culture. The culture's different. Let's keep reading. It says, although New York was the principal destination of blacks from the Caribbean, then as now, the 1930 census showed that there were more than 4 times as many native-born blacks in Manhattan as there were foreign-born blacks. And a parallel to differences between Southern and non-Southern whites, a study of West Indian blacks in the United States noted that the Negro immigrants, particularly the British West Indians bring a zest of learning that is not typical of native-born populations, close quote. And I want to touch on this again to reiterate the point I just made. Again, these people were not inundated by negative redneck culture like American-born blacks that came from the Great Migration or fleeing from the South going to the North. They didn't experience that. So they had a zest for learning that's not typical of native-born blacks. That's the history. While Black Americans have long been overrepresented among people in prison, a study of racial composition in New York State's Sing Sing prison in the early 1930s found that Black West Indians were underrepresented relative to their share of the population. So these Black West Indians wasn't getting locked up like native-born blacks were. Again, because they don't have this pervasive subculture that comes from the Celtic fringe. At a time when native-born Black Americans were overrepresented several fold among Sing Sing inmates. During the same era, when American-born Black women and West Indian Black women both worked in New York City's garment district, the latter were more frequently found at the skilled task. So the skilled workers, the skilled people, would be the Caribbeans, again, because they were not averse to learning. They were not averse to education, and they were not averse to enterprise, industry, or entrepreneurship. Let's keep reading. More generally, the study found that Black immigrants bring a cultural heritage that is vastly different from that of the American Negro. Again, the cultural heritage of the American Negro is redneck culture, which is the enemy of business, the enemy of community, the enemy of family. The first Black borough presidents of Manhattan were West Indians. As late as 1970, the highest ranking Blacks in New York's police department were West Indians, as were all the Black federal judges in the city. The 1970 census showed that the Black West Indian families in New York metropolitan area had 28% higher incomes than the families of American Blacks. The incomes of second-generation West Indian families in the same area exceeded that of the Black families by 58%. And now I don't want people to run off and try to hate on West Indians on this. We need to applaud the West Indian Blacks and try to replicate their culture. Because we replicated redneck culture and it hasn't helped us now, hasn't it? But West Indians brought a culture that was not adverse to education. They actually embrace education. They embrace entrepreneurship, and it helped. So much so that they were making more than 58% more than other Blacks, right? Since neither race nor racism can explain such differences, nor can slavery, since native-born Blacks and West Indian Blacks both had a history of slavery. So it's not just slavery as the motif, it's the people that were enslaving us. That was the impetus. The people that was enslaving us, they were just redneck peoples with a redneck culture. Studies published in 2004 indicated that an absolute majority of Black alumni of Harvard were either West Indian or African immigrants or the children of these immigrants. Again, people that's not affected by redneck Southern culture. Somewhat similar findings have emerged in studies of some other elite colleges. With Blacks as with whites, the redneck culture has been less achieving culture. Moreover, that culture has affected a higher proportion of the Black population than of the white population, since only about 1/3 of all whites lived in the antebellum South, while 9/10 of all Blacks did. Majority of the Blacks in slavery were enslaved in the South. They were affected by this less achieving culture. These West Indian and African immigrants were not. Therefore, they don't have a culture that tells them, hey, going to school is for fools, right? They don't have a culture of bullies telling them, hey, if you speak proper English, you're acting white. They don't have that. So it doesn't affect their children, and it doesn't affect their families, communities, most importantly, their pockets. But when you have 9/10 of Blacks being affected by this less achievement culture, this counterproductive culture, we can see the fruits of it, and they don't taste good. From the 1960s onward, much of the transplanted Southern culture would like Black English be seen as a sacrosanct features of a distinctive Black identity, despite their mirroring very similar culture patterns among Southern whites in times past. Not all Black Americans, of course, retain their anachronistic culture. For the spread of education and the growing experience of the counterproductive effects of Southern redneck way of life eroded it over time for many blacks, as happened also among the whites who brought the culture over from Britain. Even during the era of slavery, those blacks who were house servants in more educated homes tended to pick up a different culture, giving their descendants enduring advantages over the descendants of field hands. And that it goes back to you a house Negro and you a field Negro. Well, the field hand was stuck to menial labor and no education. And at least the house Negro actually had a fighting chance to learn how to read, write, and have an education, right? I also want to bring something else on this. What erodes this is education. If we start pushing education in our communities and making it more academic, we can erode the Southern redneck way of life. Okay. We know it can happen because it happened in times past. Those people on the Great Migration, a healthy amount of those people actually eroded this culture through education. Let's keep reading. It says contemporary black ghetto culture in the United States is not, however, a simple linear extrapolation from the culture, extrapolation, from the culture of the Southern whites. First of all, most black Americans today are no longer part of the ghetto culture. Moreover, aside from the influences peculiar to the circumstances of blacks, profound changes in larger American society around them have also had an influence both positive and negative. The burgeoning of the American welfare state in the second half of the 20th century and declining effectiveness of the American criminal justice system at the same time allowed borrowed and counterproductive cultural traits to continue and flourish among blacks who had not yet moved beyond that culture, thereby prolonging the life of a chaotic, counterproductive, dangerous, and self-destructive subculture in many urban ghettos. So he's blaming the criminal justice system and he's blaming the welfare state for fostering these cultures and allowing these cultures to persist in the ghetto. Crime and violence were among the features of this subculture that were artificially prolonged. Prior to the 1960s, while black males had a higher murder rate than other males, their murder rate was also declining more sharply than the general murder rate. Subsequently, the general murder rate in the United States and the murder rate for black males both reversed and began rising sharply, and that of black males more sharply than others. In short, the drastic changes in law enforcement and social morality during the 1960s had particularly adverse effects on the behavior and actions of blacks and on black victims if the criminals in their midst. Intellectuals have also played a role along with welfare state in prolonging and legitimizing a counterproductive culture among blacks. These intellectuals come in and say, we should be proud of this culture. No, we should not be proud of this culture. We should not parade this culture. We should not celebrate this culture. We should destroy this culture. Because again, this culture is destroying black families. And where we see black people that don't have the culture, they're successful. So we can actually pinpoint what's hurting us, what's harming us. It's our motifs. It's the culture that is the dregs of redneck culture. Okay. Let me continue to read. It says, nowhere was the effect of white liberalism of the 1960s on the social evolution of black culture more devastating than in the disintegration of the black family. The raw facts are these. As of 1960, 51% of black females between the ages of 15 and 44 were married and living with their husbands. Another 20% were divorced, widowed, or separated. And only 28% had never been married. 20 years later, only 31% of black women in these age brackets were married and living with their husbands, while 48% had never been married. By 1994, an absolute majority, 56% of black women in these age brackets were never married, and only 25% were married and living with their husbands. Accordingly, while 2/3 of black children were living with both parents in 1960, only 1/3 were by 1994. While only 22% of black children were born to unmarried women in 1960, 70% were by 1994. White liberals, instead of comparing what has happened to the black family since the liberal welfare state policies of the 1960s were put into practice, compare black families to white families and conclude that the higher rates of broken homes and unwed motherhood among blacks are due to the legacy of slavery. But why the large-scale disintegration of the black family should have been begun 100 years after slavery is left unexplained. whatever the situation of the black family relative to the white family in the past or the present. It is clear that broken homes were far more common among blacks at the end of the 20th century than they were in the middle of the century or the beginning of the century, even though blacks at the beginning of the 20th century were just one generation out of slavery. So we our family structure was stronger one generation after slavery than it is in latter years. Um, After the welfare state, we start seeing the disintegration of the black family. It said the widespread and casual abandonment of their children and of the women who bore them by black fathers in the ghettos of the late 20th century was, in fact, painfully ironic contrast with what had happened in the immediate aftermath of slavery the years earlier, when observers in the South reported desperate efforts of free blacks to find family members who had been separated from them during the era of slavery. So we went from taking care of our kids. Well, after slavery, we want to go find our kids. We want to go find our family. Now we abandon our families. So it's a stark difference here. It says when observers in the South reported desperate efforts to free blacks to find family members who had been separated from them during the era of slavery, a contemporary journalist reported meeting black men walking along the roads of Virginia and North Carolina, many of whom had walked across the state or across more than one state looking for their families. Others reported similar strenuous and even desperate efforts of newly freed blacks to find members of their families. Next segment, New England enclaves. It should be noted again that not all blacks today are part of the redneck culture. Far from it. Nor has that culture been the only culture in which blacks lived in the past. There were small but significant enclaves of New England culture introduced into southern black communities by teachers from New England who poured into the South immediately after the end of the Civil War. We covered this in a prior episode. We were dealing with this. A lot of people from the Union and Republicans came to the South to actually educate black people, to establish schools and to teach and acculturate the children of freed slaves. Often these were only schools available for black children because the South was slow to begin establishing public schools, especially for blacks. W.E.B. Du Bois called the work of these dedicated missionaries the finest thing in American history. And this is why we got to get away from racial identity politics, because what it does is it muddies the water. They don't tell you this side of history. They say all whites and all blacks was this. All whites and all blacks was X. All whites were X. All blacks were Y. Like, no, it's more nuanced than that. You have these white people that was coming in trying to help and educate us as well. The Southern whites were trying to prevent us and destroy us. And the Southern whites were Democrats. Northern whites, they had Northern Democrats, but by and large, the dominated part, the dominant party were Republicans. Let's keep reading. It says, by 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War ended, there were about 1,400 northern white teachers from dozens of religious missionary associations teaching black children in 975 southern schools. The number suggesting that these were most of the kinds of one-room schoolhouses common at the time in rural areas, which is where most southern blacks lived. Just a few years later, at the end of the decade, there were more than 2,500 northern teachers and just over 2,000 schools for the black children. A sample about 1,000 of these teachers whose origins could be traced showed that more than 500 came directly from New England, and others are believed to include people born in New England, but who came south directly from some other location. To put this in perspective, only 17% of the northern population lived in New England at that time, so this was a wholly disproportionate representation of New Englanders among those who began to educate newly emancipated blacks. This was a New England crusade, much like the pre-war abolitionist movement, and many of those who went into post-bellum South were former abolitionists. These teachers brought a wholly different culture into the South. In the words of distinguished black scholar E. Franklin Frazier, the missionaries from New England who founded the first schools for Negroes in the South left the imprint of their Puritan background upon Negro education. In addition to strict morality, these missionaries taught the Yankee virtues of industry and thrift. These cultural transformations were not incidental. The avowed purpose of the American Missionary Association was to transplant a different culture into the school and college enclaves, which they established among young blacks in the South, in order to deliberately supplant the existing culture. You see what they did? They attacked the culture. The culture was negative. So they came in, let's get rid of that culture that's holding these people back. Let's keep reading. These were deeply religious institutions, but in a New England sense, so that black students were not to indulge in the religious emotionalism of the black masses. In the South, they were to be different in many other ways, as E. Franklin Frazier noted. First, students were taught to speak English correctly and thus avoid the ungrammatical speech and dialect of the Negro masses. They were expected to be courteous, speak softly, and never exhibit the spontaneous boisterousness of ordinary Negroes. The casual Southern attitude towards sex was not tolerated. To be detected in immoral sex behavior, especially if the guilty person was a woman, meant expulsion from the school. So there was no teen sex going on. You weren't allowed to do those things. They were not lax on sex. The rednecks were lax on sex, and this is why many of these you had premarital sex going on, and many of these brides were pregnant before they were married, which was unacceptable in the North, right? Which is a good practice. Why? Because it helps strengthen your familial core, your familiar structure that way. Let's keep reading. It says the American Missionary Association was quite explicit in their desire to remove black youngsters from their existing culture and place them in enclaves of the culture transplanted from the North. In the 1882 essay titled Change of Environment by Dr. W. Patton, president of the AMA, lamented that many black children grow up in communities of prevailing ignorance, superstition, and immorality where they lived in miserable hovels, see only examples of coarseness and rudeness, and hear only a Negro dialect. And this can be applied today. We have to have this same strategy to get rid of this culture. Let's keep reading. It says, when what was needed was a total change of environment by removing young people to places where morals are pure, where manners are refined, where language is grammatical. Far from celebrating the existing culture of the black community, Dr. Patton declared all improvements must be by an influence from without, which shall quicken and inspire, which shall teach and guide. This being the purpose of planting and strengthening the educational institutions which operate to change for the better environment of the colored race in this country. So, this, like when people say, what's the solution? This is the solution. This is the solution. Transplanting the culture, removing the old culture and transplanting with a better culture. Although there was another educational tradition established at Hampton Institute in Virginia and transplanted at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama by Booker T. Washington, a graduate of Hampton, this tradition as well is based on replacing the existing culture of Southern blacks with the new imported culture. Hampton Institute founder General Samuel Chapman Armstrong declared that the average Negro student needed a residential boarding school that could control an entire 24 hours each day only thus can old ideas way be pushed out and new ones take their place. So when people say, what's your solution to this? What's your solution to help the black community? It has already been done in the past. We just need to do it again. We have the rubric. Let's go by it, right? So put them in a boarding school is important because you can pretty much purge them of these ideals every day. Let's keep reading. It said, addressing the American Missionary Association in 1877, the principal of Hampton Institute said there is no lack of those who have mental capacity. The question with him is not one of brains, but of right of instincts, morals, and of hard work. Because one thing we do know is we know the black community possess mental capacity. They have brains. They're cognate, right? They're able to. They're aware. They just have to have the instincts, morals, and hard work instilled in them. Contrary to later caricatures, neither Hampton Institute nor Tuskegee Institute was based on the assumption that blacks had the capacity to be only hewers of woods and drawers of water. And a lot of rednecks would treat us like that. Like, no, you don't need education. You're just a slave. Continue to be one. Let's keep reading. It says, in short, however, divergent the different schools of thought were on educational philosophy, as between the Hampton and Tuskegee approach and approach of the founders of the institution for blacks, they were agreed that was most needed of the advancement of blacks in the postbellum South was the replacement of the culture prevailing around them among the new imported culture. However, the greatest obstacle of creating the new culture was existing black redneck culture. For many missionaries, the physical problems of overwork, illness, and poor facilities were less frustrating than their everyday dealing with the freedmen. A constant problem for teachers was the students' absenteeism. A pupil would attend school for a few days, disappear for a time, then come back again, multiplied by a factor of 40 or 50. This had been classroom continued difficulty. This irregularity, said one teacher, was a positive vice of the freedmen. A related weakness was unreliability. You can never depend on anything promised. Went a typical complaint. Another general failing among the colored people, according to many teachers, was their tardiness at meetings, classes, services, and so on. And again, this goes back to the redneck culture. When they say, we just went to a convention with my sister, and they had to lie to the people because many of the people were black that was attending and say, hey, the meeting starts at 7. But actually, the meeting started at 8, but they had to lie because they know black people show up late. They always show up late. And this is a trait that comes from the rednecks as well. More serious were sexual offenses, theft, and lying. Many of the teachers blame such behavior on slavery, but as we have already seen, similar behaviors were among white rednecks on both sides of the Atlantic who never been enslaved. Remarkably, the northern teachers persisted in the face of difficult students in hostile white southern society from which they were excluded and by they were sometimes terrorized. Although many teachers burned out in a few years, new teachers continued to arrive from New England and other parts of the North. Thousands in post-war decades, when black colleges were founded, New Englanders were again disproportionately represented among their teachers and college presidents, and these college philosophies were that of New England. So again, we can thank our Republican Northerners for this. These institutions introduced strict behavioral standards as well as high academic standards, imposing stern discipline, developing self-discipline in the region where such was not the norm of either blacks or whites. Noted black scholar and educator Charles S. Johnson said, no less stern rectitude could have broken the grip of habits, adjusted to a now outmoded life of irresponsibility, and reshaped them into new serious purpose. W.E.B. Du Bois, himself a New Englander with the first PhD from Harvard earned it by a black man, declared the movement to plant New England College in the South by the salvation of the South and the Negro. Perhaps even more remarkable than these dedicated efforts was the fact that such efforts began to produce educational results early on. In 1871, the Georgia legislature created a board of visitors to attend the public examination of Atlanta University. The chairman of the first board of visitors was an ex-slaveholder, Joseph Brown, who reportedly said that he expected the examination to confirm the Negroes' inferiority. But the recitations of recitations of former slaves in Latin, Greek, and geometry forced from him the confession that we were impressed with the fallacy of the popular idea that the members of the African race are not capable of high grade or intellectual culture. So the education at the institution pretty much smashed the redneck expectation of black people, right? It says in Atlanta, constitutions could hardly believe what we witnessed. To see colored boys and girls 14 to 18 years of age reading in Greek and Latin and demonstrating correctly problems in algebra and geometry appears almost wonderful. However discordant the philosophy of the American Missionary Association may have been with multicultural views prevailing today, the crucial fact is that it worked, as so many today's notions do not. There was yet another route by the New England culture reached some blacks in the 19th century. Oberlin College was founded in New England by New Englanders in 1833, and its function as New England College transplanted to Ohio, an outpost of New England culture beyond the Appalachians. As one scholar put it, it was also one of the few colleges to which blacks were admitted before the Civil War, as well as being stationed on the Underground Railroad through which Southern blacks escaped from slavery. Although blacks were no more than 5% of the students at Oberlin College, Oberlin was much a more significant factor of higher education of blacks. Of the 309 blacks who were known to have received a degree from a white college in America up through 1899, nearly half received their degrees from Oberlin. The first black woman to receive a college degree in America received in Oberlin's class of 1862. She became the principal of remarkable high schools for blacks in Washington, D.C., discussed in a latter essay at Dunbar High School. Of that school's first 10 principals, 3 were graduates of Oberlin, 2 graduated from Harvard, and 1 each from Amherst and Dartmouth. In essence, most of the highly successful school principals during this formative period had New England education and New England culture, whether or not they received the education in New England itself. A wholly disproportionate share of future black leaders came from outside the school and colleges established by New Englanders in the South, not even counting Oberlin College or Dunbar High School. These alumni of institutions founded as New England enclaves in the South included W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, Walter White, Mary McLeod Bethune, A. Philip Randolph, James Farmer, Thurgood Marshall, and Martin Luther King Jr. In addition to these individuals from these Southern institutions, the first black man to graduate from Annapolis, the first black woman to earn a PhD, the first black general, the first black cabinet member, and the first black federal judge all came from the same public high school, Dunbar High School, Washington. With its culturally New England educated principles in the formative years. Such concentrations of black pioneers and leaders in a few highly atypical cultural enclaves suggest that their achievements were not solely a matter of individual ability, cream rising to the top, but were also the result of culture, very unlike that in which most blacks were raised and educated. However, much of the achievements of the individuals have been celebrated. The culture behind those achievements have not been. Today, the culture that is celebrated much in the media and the schools is not the culture that succeeded, but the culture that has failed. The black rednecks culture, when white couples who adopt black children are warned to be sure to put those children in touch with their cultural heritage. All too often, that means black redneck culture. And again, as we keep reiterating, that's the culture that we need to fight against and erode, not celebrate and continue. Internal cultural differences. Internal cultural differences among blacks have long been extreme, ranging from such things as urbanization, education, and regional distribution to rates of crime, economic achievement, and general acculturation to the norms of the surrounding society. Historically, the most fundamental differences for many generations was between those blacks who were slaves and those who were free. They differ not only in legal status, but also in regional distribution, their degree of urbanization, and even biologically. There were free blacks as far as back as the 17th century. In fact, there were free blacks before there were slaves in America. The first Africans brought in captivity to colonial Virginia in 1619 became indentured service, like the white indentured service who were common in colonial America. Only later, with the mass importation of Africans, did this change. The first law in America recognized perpetual slavery appeared in 1661 in Virginia. The small class of free blacks in colonial America had fewer restrictions than other free blacks who would have in the 19th century. Many of them and their descendants made use of their opportunities. There was free. There was a black writer named Gustavus Vasa, whose books were popular enough to go through 8 editions. We all know who Gustavus Vasa is, right? We should know. That's Equiano, right? At the time when vast majority of blacks were still illiterate slaves in the South, Benjamin Banneker was a publisher of almanacs and was also one of those who designed the layout of the city of Washington. Again, long before most blacks were either free or able to read and write. There was not just isolated individual blacks who were culturally more advanced than other blacks, but whole classes of blacks who achieved cultural levels that most blacks would not achieve until many generations later. The size of the free black population increased after the United States came into existence as an independent nation, as the ideology of freedom associated with the American Revolution led most northern states to abolish slavery. A lot of people don't even know that, even though it's something that's taught in schools. And even in the South, enough white slave owners freed their slaves to cause free black population there to nearly double and then redouble between 1790 and 1810. Both the regional distribution and the degree of urbanization of free and enslaved blacks differed greatly. After the invention of cotton gin in 1793, the cotton plantation of the Deep South began to draw slaves away from upper South states like Virginia and North Carolina toward more southerly states like Mississippi and Alabama, sometimes as individuals sold down the river, and often as part of whole plantation that relocated. Thus, geographic center of black population moved steadily southwestward and it averaged about 50 miles per decade. Meanwhile, the free persons of color were moving in the directly opposite direction. While more than 90% 90% of the antebellum black population lived in the South. The free persons of color were evenly divided between the states of the North and the South. Within the South, they tended to leave the deep South and gravitate toward the region's less oppressive places farther north. The differences in geographic distribution was so extreme that in 1860, there were more free blacks living in the city of Washington alone than in the state of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia combined. Um, these states having huge concentration of slaves, the slaves and the free also differed greatly in urbanization. While most black slaves worked in rural settings, by 1860, the free person of color were more urbanized than even the white population. Wow. Let me highlight that. If it lets me highlight it, come on, man. There were cultural consequences in these historic and geographic differences. While the vast majority of slaves could neither read nor write, the census of 1850 showed that most free persons of color were literate. But it would be half a century later, 2 generations after emancipation, before the same would be true of the black population as a whole. It would be 1940 before the black population as a whole became as urbanized as the free persons of colors were in 1850. The cultural head start of the segment of the black population endured consequences. The descendants of the antebellum free persons of colors remained predominant among black leaders in many fields well into the 20th century, and they included W.B. Du Bois, Thomas Fortune, Charles Waddell Chestnut, Thurgood Marshall, John Hope Franklin, and many others. Most black holders of doctoral degrees in the middle of the 20th century, as well as most Negroes working in professions in the nation's capital at that time, were by all indications descendants of the antebellum free persons of color, a group that was never more than 14% of the black population. As a group, the free persons of color also differed from the slaves in racial mixture. As in most of the Western Hemisphere, free slaves were often the offspring of those who freed them, and the adults freed more than female than male. And this is why I pose the question: are these people owed reparations, because they are the descendants? Many of them are descendants of Europeans, right? And a lot of people don't want to have that discussion, but I am the person that is not afraid of controversy. I will bring these questions to the forefront, as we've seen here. Right? It says while only 8% of slaves met the stringent U.S. Census requirement to have more than white ancestry to be classified as mulatto, 30% of the free persons of color did. This is not to say that all others in either category were pure African ancestors, but there were very noticeable skin color differences between the more acculturated descendants of those freed before the Civil War and those freed as a result of Emancipation Proclamation. The noticeably greater success of the former was often attributed to their white ancestry, both by whites and by some of the Negro elites themselves. But the historical and cultural antecedents of the success are undeniable. So it's more so that they had a different culture that they were allowed to indulge in. The rest of the Southern blacks were indulged in redneck culture, while these people were indulged in education, higher learning, and stuff of that nature, right? Let's continue reading. It says, moreover, the later rise of other blacks' similar levels of achievement undermines the biological explanation of these internal differences among blacks. The point here is the cultural differences led to striking socioeconomic differences among blacks. So again, culture being a problem, as they did among whites. In both races, those who lived within the redneck culture lagged far behind those who did not. That these cultural differences among blacks also coincided with the biological differences did not mean the biology explained the differences in performance. The offspring of white slave owners not only had a better chance of being free, they also tend to have better opportunities while still enslaved, being more likely to be house servants rather than field hands. And we read earlier that if you're a house servant, you're more likely to be educated, right? In some cases, living the lives of de facto free persons while still legally in bondage. Reconstruction era Black Senator Blanche K. Bruce, for example, was during the era of slavery tutored alongside his owner's son or other sons, as many believe. He was tutored by his owner's son or alongside his owner's son. During the antebellum era, there were other mulatto offspring of white slave owners who were given special consideration and aid. Some were sent to Oberlin College, sometimes with an intermediary handling financial arrangements. apparently to conceal the identity of the white father. This is not to say that most slave owners freed their mulatto offspring, but that of those blacks freed voluntarily, mulattoes were far more common among the slave population in general, and that women were freed more often than men. Moreover, this pattern prevailed throughout the Western Hemisphere. The point here is that the descendants of free persons of color had a cultural history that served them better than the cultural history of the descendants of slaves. Even after the abolition of slavery ended, differences in their legal status, whether by individual escapes from slavery by voluntary manumissions in the antebellum South or by general emancipation by law in the northern states, a black class of free persons emerged long before Emancipation Proclamation. The more prosperous of these families were able to educate their own children, sometimes through college, and these were typically lighter-skinned people as well as people generations of a head start in freedom and cultivation as compared to the mass enslaved blacks. The net result was the elite among American Negroes tended to be and remain for generations after emancipation a racially mixed group that married among themselves and formed a socially exclusive class. And I also like to bring this up because this kills racism. Well, because a lot of y'all people, we champion these people, Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, so on and so forth. But these people could very well be descendants of Europeans, and that's fine. But a lot of you people with the racial schema and color schema, this hurts you because you think that everything has to be racial purity and we all got to be the same. But that's not the case. Even Martin Luther King Jr., right? Let's continue to read. Among 19th century Negroes in Philadelphia, for example, 85% of mulatto men married mulatto women and 93% of black men married black women. This was not solely a matter of color prejudice, for there were major behavioral differences between the two groups. The mulatto neighborhoods had lower crime rates and higher percentage of their children attending school. Again, why? Because the cultural shades, the cultural social environment was different. One was leaning towards the redneck way of living, and one was leaning towards high society, right? Lower crime rates, higher percentage of their children attending school as compared to black neighborhoods, even though it can hardly be claimed that school attendance or crime rates are genetically predetermined. In short, there were major cultural differences, and these differences in turn produce other differences such as higher occupational status, better housing, and more wealth among mulattoes. So a lot of people that are race-based arguments will say, oh, see, the mulattoes were treated differently because X, Y, Z, but they never bring up culture. It's the culture. Let's keep going. Nor was this pattern confined to Philadelphia. All across the country, North and South, the elite of the Negro community were lighter in complexion than the masses, very self-conscious, sometimes snobbish about that fact. This remained so through at least the first half of the 20th century. Among the consequences, a extreme range of education and cultivation within the Negro community has been the larger society's erection of racial barriers provoked by black rednecks, which barriers deeply offended those individuals at the other end of the cultural spectrum. These barriers based on race prevented cultural elites from separating themselves as much as they would like from lower class blacks, with whom they were forced to live in proximity and share institutions. Yet protests against racial barriers had to be made in the name of all light or dark, leading to charges of hypocrisy against the elites who spearheaded protests against white social economic barriers while maintaining their own social economic barriers against the black lower class. The internal social barriers within the black community became more pronounced at the same time as white barriers against blacks. In general, suggests that more than coincidence was involved, since both occurred in the wake of the mass arrival of black rednecks from the South. And among the behavioral difference between black elites and the black masses was that the elites had more stable families, with separation or divorce being rare among them. It took more than money or a light complexion to enter the social circles of the black elite. Behavioral standards were also essential, and individuals who met these standards could be admitted with little money and regardless of complexion. Though the history of black rednecks meant that few would rise to elite levels. So again, ending that segment off on is still the culture being the main culprit in the success or failure of blacks here in America. External relations. Cultural differences affected not only the internal development of the black community, but also the way the black community as a whole was treated by a larger surrounding white community, and the way in which treatment varied over time. The small number of blacks who were free in colonial times were joined over the generations by increasing numbers of blacks who were either released from bondage or escaped on their own. The growth of this largely unacculturated population, fugitives in the rough, in the words of black historian Carter G. Woodson, in the northern cities during the first half of the 19th century brought both social barriers and discriminatory laws barring black children from schools and black adults from equal access to public accommodations. Yet, as these black communities grew more cultured over time and began to rise economically, these laws and practices began to be relaxed in many northern cities in the latter part of the 19th century. Writing 1899, W.E.B. Du Bois noted a growing liberal spirit toward a Negro in Philadelphia. This is back when liberal uh, was attributed to Republicans, because liberal means to be free, and they freed the blacks, right? In which the community was disposed to throw off the trammels, brush away petty hindrances, and to soften the harshness of race prejudice, leading, among other things, to blacks being able to live in white neighborhoods. Jacob Rees noted similar changes in New York and similar trends emerged in other northern cities in the last quarter of the 19th century. In Detroit, blacks who had been denied the vote in 1850 were voting in 1880s. In the 1890s, blacks were being elected in public office by predominantly white electorate in Michigan. The black upper class in Detroit at that time had regular social interactions with whites, and their children attended high schools and colleges with whites. In Illinois, during the same era, legal restrictions on access to public accommodations for blacks were removed from the law, even though there were not enough black voters at the time to influence public policy. So that represented changes in white public opinion. By all indication, northern black urban communities were themselves becoming cleaner, safer, and more orderly during this era, improving race relations. So changes in white public opinion were not merely inexplicable mood swings. Neither were the later retrogressions in race relations in North, which followed a massive influx of black migrations from the South, black rednecks at the beginning of the 20th century. As late in 1890, 9/10 of all blacks in the United States still lived in the South, but those who lived in northern urban communities were largely from families long settled there. Most blacks living in New York State, for example, were born in New York State. In short, there were settled communities in both regions. By all indications, the northern black communities at that time were acculturating to the norms of northern white society around them. But all of that changed radically within a relatively few years, as massive migrations from the South not only enlarged northern black communities, but transformed them culturally. How did they transform them? If you guys been paying attention, they transformed them with the redneck culture they got from the Southern whites. In 1900, the first time more than half of all blacks living in New York State had been born outside the state. Newcomers from the South became growing majorities in the northern urban communities in other states as well. The record-breaking migration of blacks from the South to the North during the first decade of the 20th century was nearly tripled during the second decade, and that in turn almost doubled again during the decade of the 1920s. Moreover, the proportion of these migrants coming from the Deep South, as distinguished from the Upper South, increased over time, which meant that the least educated and least acculturated became a growing proportion of the black migrant population moving into northern cities. There were about 30,000 blacks living in Chicago in 1900. This grew to well over about 100,000 by 1920 and more than 277,000 by 1940. In Detroit, the black population grew from a little more than 4,000 in 1900 to more than 40,000 in 1920 and over 149,000 by 1940. New York City black population is a little more than 60,000 in 1900, but grew to more than 150,000 by 1920, more than 450,000 by 1940. Writing in the midst of these massive migrations, historian Carter G. Woodson predicted the maltreatment of the Negro will be nationalized by the Exodus. This is what happened in the 100 years earlier, and how it happened again. The sheer numbers of these new black migrants from the South not only overwhelmed the relatively small black population in northern city demographically in the early 20th century, Their very different behavior patterns shocked both blacks and whites at the time, as witnessed by adverse comments from earlier black settlers and black press, denouncing the new arrivals from the South as vulgar, rowdy, unwashed, and criminal. Nor were these conclusions without foundations. For example, a study in the early 20th century Pennsylvania found that the rate of violent crimes by blacks who had migrated there were nearly 5 times the rate of such crimes by blacks born in Pennsylvania. In Washington, the rate of births out of wedlock more than doubled, with a large influx of Southern blacks in the late 19th century. Again, this is culture. They're coming from the redneck culture where they were lax on sex, they were very promiscuous, and they were very violent. So crime rose, and children born out of wedlock rose. One indication of white reaction was that blacks no longer remained as free to live in white neighborhoods. This represented a major retrogression in race relations. In the late 19th century, racial segregation of housing in northern cities was no longer what it had once been, or what it become again in the years ahead. In Detroit, as early as 1860, no neighborhood was even 50% black. In Chicago, as late as 1910, more than 2/3 of the black population lived in a neighborhood where most residents were white. But after the mass migration of blacks from the South, attempts by blacks to move into white neighborhoods in Chicago were met with violence, including bombings. Damn. New York, Philadelphia, and Washington were also cities which began to restrict blacks to the ghettos only after the massive influx of Southern blacks and their redneck culture. In many cities, blacks were prevented from moving into existing white neighborhoods, but in other cases, whites simply moved out when blacks moved in. Harlem, the first of the great northern black ghettos, was still predominantly white as late as 1910. Racial segregation in housing became an explicit law in Baltimore in 1911. In other way, in one way or another, residential segregation became the norm in northern cities. So this is where you get white flight from, right? So residential segregation was not the only transgression in the race relations during this period. Some northern and midwestern cities where schools had been racially integrated for years, black children were now segregated from white children after the mass influx of blacks from the South. Blacks in Washington were no longer allowed in white theaters, restaurants, or hotels, and their opportunities to work in white collar occupations shrank. W.E.B. Du Bois summarized these retrogressions in this way: yet it has everywhere been manifest in the long run that while a part of the Negroes were native born and trained in the culture of the city, the others were immigrants largely ignorant and unused to city life. There were, of course, manifold exceptions, but this was the rule. Thus, the history of the Negro in northern cities is the history of the rise of a small group by accretion from without, but at the same time periodically overwhelmed by them and compelled to start over again when once the material had been assimilated. In Philadelphia, for example, the native born blacks had advanced, but according to Du Bois, they were overwhelmed and dragged back by black migrants from the South. He added, in New York, the native born have been perhaps even more completely overwhelmed. This pattern confirmed in places the retrogression in race relations took place at a different time because of local differences in timing of large-scale migration of blacks from the South. In San Francisco, for example, that mass influx took place during the Second World War as blacks from the South were attracted by jobs in the new war production facilities, notably by the Kaiser shipyards. Henry Kaiser recruited Southern blacks and brought them to San Francisco Bay Area by trainloads. The black population of San Francisco, which had been less than 5,000 in 1940, rose to more than 40,000 by the time of 1950 census, and the black population of Oakland and Berkeley also rose several fold during the same decade. In the San Francisco Bay Area, as in northern cities half a century earlier, there was a long settled black population which lived free of Jim Crow laws and practices of the South, and which had been able to get service jobs as far back as the 1920s. But although the newcomers were skilled workers more often than the local black residents, culturally the newcomers lagged far behind. Native-born blacks in the Bay Area described the newcomers as foreign in the way they talk and their behavior. For example, eating hamburgers openly on the bus, and baloney and loud talking and fighting on the buses. That never happened in the old days. Again, The redneck culture is the problem. Some of the new blacks from the South were described as having little more of a chip on their shoulder than people out here did. Many local blacks thought that white racism increased after World War II when both Southern blacks and Southern whites began arriving in large numbers. A similar retrogression in racial relations on the Pacific coast during the Second World War occurred in Portland, Oregon, where again there were large influxes of black workers to take jobs in growing war industries. These new black arrivals with little education were resented by a small group of law abiding and self sustaining Negroes already living in Portland, as in other places and times. A ghetto now developed in Portland, and discrimination in regard to civil rights were instituted. On the national scene, the much later receding of racism and socioeconomic advancement of blacks in the second half of the 20th century cannot be attributed simply to the passage of time, for the passage of time had produced major retrogressions in race relations before. Nor can these advances be attributed to civil rights laws that began in the 1960s, for the advancement of blacks antedated any serious civil rights legislation by years and was in fact more dramatic in years preceding such legislation. Between 1940 and 1960, the percent of black families with incomes below the official poverty line fell from 87% to 47%. In various skilled trades, the income of blacks relative to whites more than doubled between 1936 and 1959. The principal factor that raised black incomes during that period, about absolutely irrelative to white income, was migration from low income areas to higher income areas. However, much of these migrations set back those blacks who were already living in northern cities. This movement from South put millions of blacks into places where children would get better education while their parents had better job opportunities. While the passing years and generation, more and more of these migrant families ceased to be black rednecks, cultivating themselves in new surroundings, as minority groups tend to do in countries around the world. Once again, racial barriers began to erode after World War II and before the civil rights legislation in 1960. Perhaps the most dramatic examples was the crumbling of racial barriers in professional sports, exemplified by Jackie Robinson becoming the first black Major League Baseball player in 1947, 17 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A poll that year showed his popularity to be second only by longtime entertainment idol Bing Crosby. The process of ending racial segregation in American military service was also begun during the Truman administration, years before the segregation was declared unlawful in civilian life. In 1948, President Harry Truman ran for re-election on a platform that included civil rights for blacks, which some thought would doom his candidacy, but the fact he won suggests that white public opinion had already begun to change. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 dealt major blows to racial restrictions, especially in the South, and had dramatic effects in the number of blacks elected officials. Economically, however, the upward trends in black income and occupation that had begun decades earlier simply continued, but at no accelerated rate. The rise of blacks into professional and other high-level occupations was, in fact, greater in the years preceding the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than the years afterward. It was greater in the 1940s and 1950s. Behind such developments was the fact that blacks were closing the gap between themselves and whites in years of schooling during this era. In short, major social transformation within the black community were having impact on their economic condition. Again, the culture. So when people ask, what's the solution? What's the solution? Get rid of the redneck culture or the ghetto black culture, and things will change. So it would hardly be surprised if it also had an impact on how whites view blacks. As had happened in the 19th century, the civil rights legislation in the 1960s may well have been an effect of the rise of blacks rather than the sole predominant cause of that rise, as it had been represented by as being by those leaders, black and white, when incentives to magnify their own role in racial progress. The difference between cultural explanation of changing racial relations and explanation based on political acts or swings of the pendulum in white public opinion is not just a matter of intellectual preference. There are wholly different implications, not only about the past, but especially about the future. The question is whether the advancement of blacks is helped or hindered by promoting a black identity built around redneck culture whose track record has been largely negative for both blacks in whites. White liberals. White liberals in many roles as intellectuals, politicians, celebrities, judges, teachers have aided and abetted in the perpetuation of counterproductive and self-destructive. And this right here is going to be very important, right? Lifestyle among black rednecks. The welfare state has made it economically possible to avoid many of the painful consequences of this lifestyle, forced previous generations of blacks and whites to move away from the redneck culture and its values. Lax law enforcement has enabled violent and criminal aspects of this culture to persist, and non-judgmental intellectual trends have enabled it to escape moral condemnation. As far back as 1901, W.B. Du Bois, while complaining of racial discrimination against blacks, also condemned indiscriminate charity for its bad effects within the black community. In the latter era, the burgeoning welfare state, especially since the 1960s, has spread an indiscriminate charity in both money and attitudes that has given the black redneck culture a new lease on life. Intellectuals have been particularly prominent among those who have turned the black redneck culture into a sacrosanct symbol of racial identity. This includes both black and white intellectuals, though the latter predominant numerically in terms of influence through the media and academia. Intellectuals have promoted misconceptions of history, misreadings of contemporary life, and counterproductive notions of how to prepare for the future. By projecting a vision of a world in which the problems of blacks are consequences of the actions of whites, either immediately or in the times past, white liberals have provided a blanket excuse for shortcomings and even crimes by blacks. The very possibility of any internal culture sources of the problems of blacks have been banished from consideration by fashionable phrase blaming the victim. But no one can be blamed for being born into a culture that evolved in centuries past, even though moving beyond such culture may do more for future advancement than blaming others or seeking special dispensations. So again, he's going at the liberals and Democrats, and it's so ironic because these liberals and Democrats are the reason why many of these blacks are suffering, because the culture came from them. A lot of these laws that prevented us to get wealth came from them. Well, let's continue reading. Next segment, blaming others. Blaming others for anything in which blacks lags have become standard operating procedure among white liberals. If blacks do not pass bar exams or medical board tests as often as whites or Asians, then that shows that something is wrong with those tests. As far as many white liberals are concerned, best-selling author Andrew Hacker, for example, says that academic problems in general are created for black students in white colleges because such colleges use curricula that are white in logic and learning, and their conceptions of scholarly knowledge and demeanor. While this does not seem to be a problem for Asian students, remain unexplained. Even though blacks have lived in this white society for centuries longer than either Asian Americans or contemporary immigrants from Asia. Why is it not a problem for blacks from the Caribbean? It's another unexplained contradiction of such white liberals' excuses for American-born blacks. So again, where this redneck culture doesn't persist, black people do fine. Blacks from the Caribbean do fine. African migrants do fine in this education system. But native-born blacks that have the redneck culture that's pervasive amongst them, they suffer in these institutions because why? The culture that they're involved in is counter science. It's anti-science. It's anti-education. It's anti-family. Let's continue to read. It says, if black attorneys are not elevated in partnerships and law firms in proportion to their numbers, then to New York Times, this shows in the words of their front page headline, law firms are slow in promoting minority lawyers to partner role. Apparently, there can only be external reasons for anything negative that happens to blacks. According to Andrew Hacker, the fact that white taxi drivers often pass up black males seeking a ride, especially at night, shows that these drivers to be patently racist, even though black taxi drivers do the same in order to avoid becoming victims of crime. White liberals long denied that there were higher crime rates among blacks by pointing out the imperfections of crime statistics in general, or more specifically claiming that blacks are simply arrested more often for things that whites would not be arrested for. It says, but if the imperfection of crime statistics were the real problem, then discussions would be limited to murder statistics. Since dead bodies are not ignored, whether they are black or white, and neither are murderers, whatever their race. But murder statistics show the same disproportionate number of crimes by blacks as other statistics do. While murder statistics might provide more accuracy, they would not provide white liberals with a means of evading the obvious. Riots by blacks are almost automatically blamed on whites, whether in Kerner report on the riots of the 1960s or in reactions among white liberals of Los Angeles riots of 1992. Some white liberal circles, the New York Times, for example, the police are almost automatically at fault. A confrontation with black criminals, hoodlums, or rioters. When the police arrive on the scene of crime or violence in black communities, whatever they do is likely to categorize later as either having let the situation get out of hand or having used excessive force. Any force sufficient to prevent this situation from getting out of hand is almost certain to be called excessive force by white liberals in the media, so that by definition, the police acted badly, no matter what they did or failed to do. Should the police arrive in such an overwhelming numbers as to bring disorder to a quick halt while they need to use force at all, then they will often be said to have overreacted by sending so many cops to deal with unresisting people. One of the reactions of the police to such predictable scapegoating in the media has been to depolice some of the most violent black neighborhoods, looking the other way rather than risking a whole career ruined by media charges of racism. And we discussed this before. Depolicing, defunding the police is bad because in these violent places, they need police. It's just that simple. This gives criminals, hoodlums, and rioters a freer hand at the expense of the law abiding blacks, who may be the great majority, even in a high crime neighborhood. Because again, it's a low percentage of these communities that are actually operating outside the law. So these people that are operating inside the law are the victims. It's that simple. It says there is evidence that this is, in fact, what happens after a barrage of adverse media coverage against the police. The incorrigibility of white society and the corresponding futility of black efforts to improve their situation by improving their own education and other qualifications is another layered motif of much white liberal writing. After the U.S. Supreme Court struck down some racially gerrymandered congressional districts, forcing some black members of Congress to run to districts where most voters were white, New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis said, "The reality in the South is that black men and women, however well qualified, have little chance of winning in white districts. But these Southern black candidates were, in fact, reelected." So that's a contradiction. The fact that black rednecks exhibit the same hostility and violence toward other minorities, along associated with bigoted white rednecks in the South, presents white liberals with another challenge to find a way to evade the obvious. Black anti-Semitism, for example, is not recognized by Andrew Hacker, who claims that no one really knows if blacks and whites differ markedly in their feelings about Jews, despite survey after survey showing greater hostility to Jews among blacks. Black hostility to other minorities, such as Koreans, has likewise often been ignored by such liberal publications as the New York Times, or even to find out of existence by the variety of white liberal writers on the grounds that racism requires power, which blacks do not have. Following that logic, Nazis were not anti-Semites until they gained control of the German government, and the Ku Klux Klan today will not be called racist anymore because it had lost its power it once had. But the arbitrary proviso of power was never part of the definition of racism until racism among blacks became widespread enough to require a convenient invasion. The thuggish gutter words and brutal hoodlum lifestyle of gangster rap musicians are not merely condoned but glorified by many of the white intellectuals and understood by others lacking the courage to take responsibility for siding the savagery. The National Council of Teachers urged the use of hip hop in urban classrooms. Cultural editor of The Sun, Francisco Chronicle, characterized rapper Tupac Shakur as a lightning rod of insurrection in the name of social justice. USA Today said gangster rap is rooted in part of the underfunded school system, which failed to equip students with the skills to speak out effectively interested with the larger communities. An article in New Republic said that rap music has become the nearest thing to political voice of the poor. That's kind of sad. Let me continue reading. Michael Gamore, a Rolling Stone of all the terrible forces responsible for such wasteful and justifiable end to the life of rapper Tupac Shakur by the very lawless violence he had sung of and lived, not by some mysterious forces. The blaming of gangster rap barbarism on social conditions taking many forms, such as that of Boston Globe columnists who depicted it as deriving from the institutional differences that thrives wherever poor people assemble in America. Struggling schools, dangerous streets, long-gone factories, hospital emergency rooms, or EMT substituting for family doctors. Futures measured by sunset and sunrise and the dull feeling that nearly everything is against you. A New York Times essay dismissing critics of gangster rap referred to the poverty and hopelessness that fosters vicious behavior. The general orientation of white liberals have been one of what can we do for them? What blacks can do for themselves has not been only the lesson interest, but of what blacks have in fact already done for themselves has been overshadowed by liberal attempts to get them special dispensations. And see, this is the problem with the liberals, the Democrats. It's never, oh, what can we do for them? When they say what we can do for them, run like hell, because every time they incorporate something or a policy is passed by Democrats for the quote unquote benefit of blacks, we suffer. Let's run like hell. But what they won't bring up is what blacks can do for ourselves. And what we can do for ourselves is erode and remove the negative culture that has kept us in a hole, that has kept us behind the 8 ball for hundreds of years. Let's get rid of this redneck culture and stop glorifying the things that destroy us. And again, the 3 things we need for a successful community is family, education, and job participation. Let's go into those areas and we can actually succeed. Let's continue reading. It says, whether affirmative action, reparation for slavery, or other race-based benefits, even when the net effect of these dispensations have been much less than the effects of the blacks' own self-advancement. For example, although the greatest reduction in poverty among blacks occurred before the Civil Rights Revolution of 1960, the liberal vision in which black lags are explained by white oppression requires black advances to be explained by the fight against such oppression, symbolized by the civil rights legislation of 1960. This scenario has been repeated so often, though, through so many channels that it has become a well-known fact by sheer repetition. Moreover, this protest and government action model has become the liberals' preferred, if not universal, model for future black advancement. And the real black advancement is when we get rid of this culture and we start to make strides. All right, so the next part is the misconception of history. Many of the prevailing histories of blacks and whites in America derive from trying to amalgamate morality and causation. I'm gonna stop it here, and I may pick up later. We're about 70 pages in. I can read this whole book live, but I'm gonna stop it here, and we can continue it in a following episode. All right. So again, that's black rednecks and white liberals. Again, a lot of the negative culture, the negative elements that we find in black ghetto culture comes from rednecks. And if we can remove that culture, if we get rid of those elements, we can do better for ourselves and our communities. All right. So with that, I say shalom, shalom, my brother Christo. Shalom to everybody. Shalom. We Japanese still. You getting cooked in front of your family like a Japanese meal. It's Yashub the Hibachi, and none of you niggas can stop me. 7 candlesticks up.
Make a slap trip. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it. Nigga, stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Nigga, we ain't playing around. Karate chop, nigga, that's gonna lay him down. I got it from my my sensei. A Ku Klux, so I bought me 10Ks. My shooter got me, I made sure his rent paid. A grimy nigga, but he don't wear 10K. He wears a Vinci, he don't even fit J's. A sharpshooter, you should see him switchblade. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Add me on Twitter, that's gonna get you in the jam. Stop playing with that man. 223 shells and knock a nigga out his frame. Stop playing with that man. Ever been indicted? I ain't see you in that jam. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Niggas acting like fans. Some shit I never understand. Is you gangster or not? That's for Instagram, you don't hang on the block. This a Hunt Diddy, I don't hang with no stocks. You a brand lover, bitch, you bang with the ops. You like felons, cause I came with a lot. A tough cookie put his brains in a knot. How much I pay for these chains, it's a lot. Stop talking money if you really don't got it. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop playing with that man. Nigga already know what the deal is, nigga. Yeah, I should already know by now. Don't play with him. We're not the ones to play with. What is money? Don't make us throw it up in the air and walk away. Put a price on your head on a sticky pad. Stop playing.